Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. Moving to a new house is always a big change. For me, it felt like a chance to rebuild after everything that had fallen apart. My name is Sarah, and I'm a single mom to two young kids, Emma, who's 9, and Noah, who's 6. We had just moved from a small town in Oklahoma to a little house on the outskirts of a small town in Texas. The house was old, but it was affordable, and that was all that really mattered to me at the time. The first few days were a whirlwind. There were boxes everywhere, piled up in the hallways, in the living room, spilling out into the kitchen. I spent my days unpacking, trying to get the kids settled, making sure they felt safe in this new space. But even as I moved around, stacking dishes in cabinets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, I thought it was just the stress of the move. I was so exhausted from all the packing and the unpacking that I figured I was just overtired. But soon, small things began to happen, things that made me feel more uneasy than I could explain. It started in the kitchen. One morning, I was trying to get breakfast ready. Emma had a thing for peanut butter toast, so I went to grab the jar from the counter, but it wasn't there. It wasn't on the counter where I usually left it. I thought maybe I had moved it to the pantry, so I went over to check, but there was nothing. I walked to the refrigerator, checked there too. Nothing. I remember standing there for a moment, staring at the empty counter, trying to make sense of it. Had I taken it upstairs with me? Maybe I was losing my mind. I had so much on my plate. But then I found myself doing it again the next day. I went to the pantry, intending to grab a snack for the kids. I reached for the bag of chips I had just bought, but when I opened the cupboard, it was gone. Not a trace of it. I felt a weird tightness in my chest, like a little knot of anxiety, but I dismissed it. Maybe Emma had taken it. She had a way of sneaking snacks without asking. I called out to her from the other room, asking if she had eaten the chips. She looked at me, her face innocent, and shook her head. "No, Mom, I didn't eat them." It didn't make sense. I checked the kids' room to see if they had any snack wrappers hidden under their beds, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel like I was imagining things, like maybe I was just overwhelmed by everything, the new house, the unpacking, the kids' routine. It was all a lot. But things only started to escalate. The more I spent time in the house, the more I began to feel watched. It was hard to explain. At first, it was just a sense that something wasn't right. It was like the air felt thicker at times, heavier, like it was pressing against me. I thought maybe I was just tired, or maybe I was just adjusting to being in a new place. But it kept happening, and the more it did, the more I felt uneasy in my own skin. One afternoon, I was cleaning the kitchen, wiping down counters, rearranging things, when I noticed the kitchen drawer. It wasn't open all the way, but it was just enough for me to see the edge of a spoon sticking out. I knew I hadn't left it like that. I was meticulous about keeping things in order, especially in the kitchen. I opened the drawer fully, expecting to find something out of place, but everything was where it should be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I'd feel a little uneasy, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, my feet tucked up under me on the couch, watching a show on the TV. Emma and Noah were in the other room, playing, their laughter muffled by the walls. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes when you're alone at night, with only the soft creak of floorboards and the occasional shift in the walls. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but an unsettling one. Every small noise felt amplified. The creak above, the hum of the fridge, and something more. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again, a soft scrape. It was coming from the kitchen, faint but unmistakable. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, closer this time. The scraping noise was almost rhythmic, like something being dragged across the floor. I stood up, my heart starting to race. The kids were playing in the other room. I couldn't just leave them alone. I crept toward the kitchen, my footsteps slow and deliberate. When I reached the door, I paused, my hand on the handle, and took a deep breath. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I pushed the door open, my pulse hammering in my ears. The kitchen was empty. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting shadows along the walls. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fridge door was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it like that. I stepped inside, my feet barely making a sound on the cold tile. I walked over to the fridge and closed it. I was about to turn around when I noticed something on the floor. A small, crumpled receipt. It wasn't mine. I bent down to pick it up, frowning. The receipt was for a small store, but I didn't recognize the name of the place. It wasn't a store I'd been to. I checked the kids' room again to see if they had brought something in, but they hadn't. It didn't make sense. My breath hitched as a chill ran down my spine. It felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't tell from where. I quickly grabbed the receipt and tossed it into the trash, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my house, watching me. It was an irrational thought, I knew, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't ignore it. I decided to go upstairs and check on the kids. When I opened their bedroom door, I found them both fast asleep, tangled up in their blankets. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief, but the unease lingered. I closed the door quietly, careful not to wake them, and went back downstairs. The night felt even quieter now. The creaks in the floorboards were louder, and every little sound seemed to echo in the silence. I was on edge, my eyes darting around the room, half expecting something to move out of the corner of my eye, but nothing did. I couldn't sleep that night. The days started to blend together. I continued with my daily routine, but the sense of being watched never left. Every time I walked through the house, I felt as though someone was just behind me, breathing down my neck. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that it was just the stress of the move, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until a few nights later that I realized I was right. I had gone to bed early that evening, feeling exhausted. The house was still, eerily so. The kids were asleep, and I had just settled into bed, pulling the covers up around me. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting soft shadows across the room. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I closed my eyes, trying to drift off to sleep, but then I heard it, the faintest sound, a soft creak. It came from above me, from the attic. I froze, my eyes snapping open. It was so quiet that at first I wasn't sure I'd really heard it, but then there it was again, a slow, deliberate creak, followed by another. This time, it was louder, closer. My heart started to race. I was paralyzed with fear. The sound came again, this time unmistakable. Footsteps, light but heavy, as if someone was walking carefully, deliberately across the attic floor. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator answered, and I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling, "Someone is in my house." The operator told me that help was on the way, but I couldn't take my eyes off the attic door. Every second felt like an eternity. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, just as I thought I would lose control, I heard the softest sound, the attic door creaking open. I felt my blood run cold. It was too late to run. My only hope was that help would arrive in time. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound of sirens pierced the silence. The footsteps above me froze. There was a moment of tense silence before the door to my room burst open. The officers rushed in, their guns drawn, and the man who had been in my attic was arrested. He was disheveled, his eyes wild. He had been living in the attic for weeks. He had been sneaking down at night, taking food, watching us. The police told me later that he had been planning to strike. He thought he had the perfect opportunity when I was distracted, alone in my room. He was caught. And the house, our house, felt just a little bit safer, even though the fear never fully left. The feeling of being watched faded after the man was arrested, but it lingered for a while, especially with every creak in the floorboards or the house settling. Yet, over time, the noises became just part of the charm of a home settling into its own rhythm. I never imagined a new house could bring such unexpected challenges, but in the end, it became a place of peace, one I now truly call home. My name is Rachel, and I'm 17 years old. I'm sure you've probably heard of people telling stories about how they had to babysit some creepy kid, or how something strange happened while they were watching someone else's house. But trust me, I never imagined anything like this would ever happen to me. I always thought those stories were just exaggerated or overhyped. But the thing is, this wasn't a made-up story. It was real, and I've never been able to forget what happened that night. It all started on a crisp Saturday evening, the kind of night when you can feel fall creeping in. The air was cool, but not too cold, just that perfect temperature where it's chilly enough to make you pull your jacket a little tighter, but not enough to make you shiver. I had just gotten home from the high school football game, feeling the usual mix of excitement and adrenaline from the event. I'd been planning to spend the night in, maybe catch up on some schoolwork or watch a movie, but then my mom handed me a message from one of our neighbors. Apparently, a family from a couple of blocks away needed a last-minute babysitter. I was about to say no. After all, I had just gotten home and was ready to relax, but then I saw the pay they were offering. It was more than what I usually made. A lot more. I've always been good with kids, and I figured, why not? The house wasn't too far, and it would give me something to do, not to mention some extra cash. So I agreed, though part of me still hesitated as I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. When I pulled up to the house, I immediately noticed how big it was. The house was at least 3 stories, with white painted siding that gleamed in the dimming light. The large front porch had intricate columns and big windows that made the house look grand and imposing. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, I realized how odd it was that this house seemed so secluded from the rest of the neighborhood. The trees surrounding it were tall, casting long shadows across the yard. The whole place felt like it was hidden away, as if it was trying to keep something secret. I parked my car on the long, winding driveway and got out. The ground was littered with a few dead leaves that had fallen from the trees, crunching under my shoes as I made my way to the door. I tried to shake the unease I felt creeping up on me. It wasn't that I was scared, but more like there was something off. I rang the doorbell, and it took a minute before anyone answered. When the door finally opened, a woman greeted me with a big smile that seemed a little too wide for comfort. She was in her mid-40s, I'd say, and her clothes looked nice but kind of outdated, like she had been stuck in the 90s. She introduced herself as Mrs. Davis and welcomed me inside with an air of politeness. "Rachel, right? Thank you so much for coming," she said, ushering me into the house. The smell of something faintly floral lingered in the air, and the place was quiet, almost too quiet. The floors were polished wood, and the walls were lined with what looked like family portraits, some of them old, some of them more recent. The furniture was bulky, classic, and way too formal for my taste, like a showroom you'd find in some antique store. Mrs. Davis led me to the living room, where she explained that her baby, Noah, was upstairs sleeping and that I should keep an eye on him while she and her husband went out to a dinner party. She gave me some quick instructions on where the baby's things were, how to contact her in case anything went wrong, and a few more details that I barely listened to because I was too busy looking around. Everything felt so still, like there was no sound, no background noise. "The nursery's just upstairs," she said. "He's a really easy baby, so you shouldn't have any problems. You know, I just realized we forgot to put away some of his toys. It's probably nothing, but if you want to put them in the basket over there, that would be a big help. He's been crawling around a lot more these days, and we don't want him tripping." I nodded absently, trying to be polite. Her smile never wavered. After Mrs. Davis gave me a quick rundown of things, she kissed Noah on the forehead and left, leaving me alone in the giant house. For a few minutes, I just stood there, letting the silence settle around me. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock in the corner and the sound of my own breath filling the space. The house was too big for just one baby, and it felt so strange being alone in it. I made my way upstairs to check on Noah, peering into the nursery. He was in his crib, wrapped snugly in a blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. I smiled at the sight. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of anything that might be going on outside his little world. I left him alone after making sure he was comfortable, and then I went back downstairs to settle in for what I thought would be a quiet night. But then, around 9 p.m., I heard it. A soft knock on the door. It wasn't loud, just a gentle tap. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the knocking came again, a little louder this time. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that I was scared exactly. I didn't want to seem like a nervous wreck. But there was something about it that felt wrong. I stood frozen, trying to think of any reason why anyone would be knocking at the door. No one was supposed to come by. Mrs. Davis hadn't mentioned any visitors. I walked to the front door, trying to keep calm, and peered through the peephole. At first, I didn't see anyone. But then, I noticed a figure standing just at the edge of the porch. It was an elderly woman, bent over slightly, her gray hair tied back in a messy bun. She was wearing an old, faded floral dress and a cardigan that was stretched out at the elbows. She looked frail, her face pale and lined with age. The kind of woman you might expect to see in an old photo album from your grandparents. I hesitated, feeling that uncomfortable feeling in my chest tighten. Something wasn't right. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto the peephole. She raised one hand slowly, waving at me as if she knew I was there, watching. For a moment, I couldn't move. I wasn't sure what to do. I opened the door just a crack. The chain still latched. "Yes?" I asked, my voice sounding far steadier than I felt. The woman looked at me and smiled, but it wasn't a warm, kind smile. It was strained, as though it took everything she had to force it out. "I'm so sorry to bother you, dear," she said, her voice shaky but still polite. "I live just next door, and there's been a power outage at my house. I was hoping I could borrow your phone." I was immediately suspicious. I didn't know anyone in the neighborhood who was old enough to live alone, and even if there was, I couldn't just let some stranger inside my employer's house. "I'm sorry, but I can't let anyone inside," I said, my voice a little firmer this time. "I'm babysitting." The woman didn't seem upset, though. She simply nodded slowly, her wide eyes still staring at me with unnerving intensity. She didn't take a step back. Instead, she lingered on the porch, still staring at me. For a moment, we both stood there in silence, and I could feel her gaze like a weight pressing down on me. It was as if she was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. But when she didn't say anything else, I slowly shut the door, the chain rattling slightly as it clicked into place. I turned and looked back toward the baby monitor. Noah was still sleeping soundly, but that uncomfortable feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. It was a message from Mrs. Davis, confirming she and her husband were on their way to the dinner party and asking if everything was going well. I quickly texted back, saying everything was fine, but the strange encounter with the elderly woman lingered in my mind. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at me, but it wasn't easy. The house, though beautiful, felt too quiet, too still. The kind of quiet where every creak of wood, every soft sound felt like it was amplified. The kind of quiet that makes your thoughts feel louder than they should be, and you can't help but think about every little detail until you convince yourself something is wrong. And that was exactly what happened. I tried to focus on the book I had been reading earlier, but the words blurred together as I kept glancing up toward the front door, expecting the woman to appear again. I had locked everything before, and I made sure to double-check the doors once more. But for some reason, every lock felt insufficient, like it wasn't enough to protect me from whatever was out there. I could have sworn I heard something faint, a rustling sound coming from somewhere upstairs. It wasn't Noah's cries, it was something else. A soft shuffle of footsteps, maybe? I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. There was that strange old woman, the uncomfortable, forced smile, the way she stared at me through the peephole, and why hadn't she left after I turned her down? Why had she just stood there, lingering, as if waiting for something? The baby monitor sitting on the coffee table flickered to life, a brief moment of static followed by a faint crackling sound. I froze, heart leaping into my throat. I glanced over at the screen. Noah was still in his crib, peacefully asleep. But as the static cleared, I thought I saw a figure move in the hallway outside the nursery. I blinked and stared harder. Nothing. Noah still slept soundly, his small body rising and falling gently with each breath. I shook my head, thinking maybe the monitor was just malfunctioning. The baby wasn't moving, after all. Maybe it was the weird angle or the flickering lights that made it look like something shifted. But the feeling in my stomach didn't go away. The longer I stared at the monitor, the more sure I became that I had seen something. Something moving. Something. Or someone. My pulse quickened. I couldn't just sit here waiting for my mind to play tricks on me. Without really thinking, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a long, sharp kitchen knife from the counter. My hands were trembling, but I gripped the handle so tightly I thought my fingers might cramp. The knife felt too big for my hands, but I held onto it as if it was the only thing that could protect me. My heart thudded in my chest as I crept up the stairs, trying to move as quietly as possible. The house was still. Too still. No sound of footsteps, no whispers, just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the sound of my breath filling my ears. I reached the top of the stairs and paused. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and narrow, with doors leading into rooms on either side. I could barely see anything beyond the light from the stairwell. The nursery door was just ahead, cracked slightly open. I had left it fully closed earlier, but now it was open just enough to make my skin crawl. The knot in my stomach tightened. I felt like I was walking in slow motion, my feet barely making a sound as I moved toward the nursery. Every creak of the floorboards beneath me felt like a bomb going off in the silence. I could hear my own breathing now, shallow and quick, as I reached out and pushed the nursery door open. The room looked untouched. Noah was still lying peacefully in his crib, his tiny face relaxed in sleep, his fingers curled slightly. For a moment, I stood there trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that nothing was wrong. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The closet. It was the way the bifold doors were slightly open, just wide enough that I could see a pair of bare feet sticking out from beneath the clothes hanging there. I felt my breath catch in my throat. For a moment, I thought I must have been seeing things. Maybe it was just the shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But no, there they were, bare feet, hidden behind the fabric, partially covered in the shadow of the closet. I took a step backward, my heart racing in my chest. My first instinct was to call out, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if something was really happening, but I couldn't just stand there. I had to do something. Suddenly, the closet door swung wide open with a loud bang. A man. He lunged out at me, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and terror. His clothes were dark and unremarkable, just a simple jacket and jeans. He didn't say anything, just lunged at me with a speed I wasn't expecting. My heart leapt into my throat as I instinctively stepped back, but he was already too close. In a panic, I slashed out with the knife, trying to protect myself. The blade connected with his arm, and he let out a sharp hiss, stumbling back, but he didn't stop. His face contorted in anger, and he growled low in his throat, his eyes narrowing as he staggered toward me again. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed for a split second, unsure whether to run or keep fighting. Then I heard the sound of Noah crying from his crib. It broke through the fog of panic in my head. I had to get to him. I had to protect him. I swung the knife again at the man, and he stumbled back and tripped. I immediately ran toward the crib, scooping Noah up as quickly as I could. His little body was trembling in my arms, and his cries were louder now. I could feel my own heart pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I turned and bolted for the stairs. Every step was a blur, my mind fixated on getting to safety. But the man was right behind me. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me, each one a reminder that I wasn't safe yet. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed through the living room and straight into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I set Noah down, still crying, on the floor beside me as I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't hold it, but I managed to dial 911. The phone rang once, twice. I could feel my chest tightening as I waited, praying someone would pick up. Finally, I heard the operator's voice. I could barely speak. My words were frantic and broken as I explained what had happened, what I had seen, and what I was still hearing. "Stay on the line, ma'am. We're sending officers right now. Stay inside, lock the door. Help is on the way." But I didn't feel safe. The man was still out there. He was still in the house. I sat there, huddled in the small, dimly lit bathroom with Noah in my lap. I tried to calm him as best as I could, whispering soft words that I didn't even know if he could understand, but my mind was racing. Every sound, every creak in the house sent my pulse spiking. Was he still in the house? Was he coming for us? I could hear noises now from somewhere in the house, faint but unmistakable. The sound of furniture scraping, footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, followed by a soft thud, then another thud, like someone walking through the house searching for us. The minutes felt like hours, and I kept thinking back to that woman, the one who had knocked on the door earlier. Had she been a distraction? Had she led me into this? Maybe she was in on it. Maybe the whole thing had been planned from the start. I kept my back pressed to the bathroom door, clutching the phone in my hand like it was the only thing that could save me. The 911 operator had told me to stay inside, stay locked up, and wait for the police. But with each second that ticked by, my fear only grew. Minutes later, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder. The police were finally on their way. I tried to keep calm, but my nerves were stretched thin, and every sound made my heart skip a beat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the front door slam open and the sound of heavy boots echoing through the house. Shouting followed voices, commands, the unmistakable sound of the police clearing the house. Relief washed over me, but I was still paralyzed, still too scared to move. 2 officers came into the bathroom, quickly checking the room and surrounding areas. One of them knelt next to me, gently prying Noah from my arms. He reassured me that everything would be okay. They would find the intruder. They would make sure no one else was in the house. They searched every corner of the house. It felt like hours before they came back to me. "I don't know how to explain this," one of the officers said, looking uneasy. "But the man you saw, he's gone. We've searched the entire property. There's no sign of him. There is, however, a broken latch on the nursery window. We think he might have entered through there while you were distracted by the woman you mentioned in your call. We found out that there is no elderly woman living next door. She was not the real neighbor. The man you saw in the closet, he was likely her accomplice, using the distraction to break in and wait for you to let your guard down. I never found out who they were. The police never caught the suspects. I never found out why she and her accomplice had chosen me that night, why they had targeted that house." It was a Friday afternoon, and I was feeling excited, like really excited. My parents were heading out of town for the weekend, leaving me alone in our house for 2 whole days. They were going to some wedding in Nevada, a fancy one I didn't even care about. I had my own plans. I was 16 and had always looked forward to the day when I could be home alone for an entire weekend. No rules, no curfews. It was freedom. Our house was a typical California ranch-style home, single story, 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a big window that looked out onto the street. From the front porch, you could see down the block, past a couple of houses, to the big oak tree that sat at the corner of our cul-de-sac. The whole neighborhood was quiet, especially at night. It had that kind of suburban peace to it, where you'd hear every car passing, the occasional dog barking, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. My parents left just after lunch, so the house was empty and silent by early afternoon. I didn't have to worry about anything. The only thing on my mind was the fact that I could finally do whatever I wanted without anyone breathing down my neck. I spent the first couple of hours lounging on the couch, scrolling through my phone and watching random YouTube videos. Around 8 p.m., I ordered pizza, the one thing I could never get enough of. I devoured the cheesy slices as I continued binge-watching gaming videos. Life was simple, and it felt like it would stay that way all weekend. No school, no stress. I figured I'd stay up late playing video games, eat more junk food, and maybe even finish a little homework just to avoid feeling guilty later. By midnight, though, I reluctantly sat down with my laptop to do some math homework. I wasn't feeling it, but I knew I had to get it done. Time seemed to stretch as I worked through the problems. The clock ticked by slowly. At some point, I realized I'd barely even touched the surface of what I had to do. I kept getting distracted, thinking about how much more fun it would be if I just went back to the couch. Finally, I finished everything around 1:30 a.m. My eyes were drooping, and I could feel the weight of sleepiness pushing me toward my bed. The house was quiet, too quiet. I shuffled to my room, turning off the lights in the hallway as I went. The soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen was the only noise that filled the silence. I threw myself into bed, trying to get comfortable under the blankets. It wasn't long before I closed my eyes, the exhaustion taking over. I don't know how long I'd been asleep, but the sudden buzz of my phone woke me up with a start. 2:13 a.m. I groggily reached for my phone, squinting at the screen. My thumb barely hit the right spot as I unlocked it. When I saw the text from my mom, I froze. "Stay quiet. Call 911. Someone's outside." My pulse spiked immediately. What the hell? It was like my body woke up all at once, the grogginess evaporating. The text didn't explain anything, just that someone was outside in a photo, which was sent by our neighbor. I quickly opened the attached photo. It was grainy, barely clear, but I could make out a figure standing on our front porch. The image was dark, blurry, but there was no mistaking it. A man, wearing dark clothes, half hidden by shadows, was standing there, barely visible in the light from the street lamp. My heart began to pound. I wasn't sure what to do. My first instinct was to get up, look outside, but then I hesitated. What if the guy was still out there, watching? I didn't hear anything. No knocks, no footsteps. My phone felt heavy in my hand. I stared at the message for a few more seconds before I decided to get out of bed and check the situation. I moved cautiously, almost mechanically, like my body was still half asleep, but my mind was fully alert now. The night was still, almost too still. My feet were bare against the cold wooden floor as I crept toward the window. My fingers brushed against the edge of the curtain, and I slowly pulled it back to peek outside. The front porch was empty. Nothing. I let out a slow breath, feeling a slight wave of relief. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe I was overthinking it. I stood there for a moment, watching the stillness of the street. There was no movement, no sign of anyone. But then, suddenly, crash! The sound of breaking glass sliced through the silence. I froze, my entire body tensing. The noise came from downstairs and my stomach dropped. Someone had just broken into the house. I was no longer imagining things. The situation was real. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I hide? Should I call 911? I grabbed my phone in a panic and ducked into the closet, closing the door quietly behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The operator picked up on the first ring. My voice was barely a whisper, and I tried to explain what was happening. Someone had broken into my house, and I was alone. I could barely make sense of my own words, but the operator stayed calm, asking me to stay quiet and hide until the police arrived. My head was spinning. I listened for any sound in the house, trying to keep track of where the intruder was. I heard footsteps, heavy and slow, coming from the lower floor, moving through the house. Someone was walking around, searching. The creaking of the floorboards felt like it was getting closer. Then a soft rattle, the door handle. Someone was trying to open my bedroom door. My heart skipped a beat. The rattle stopped. For a moment, I thought they might have given up. Maybe they had moved on, thinking the room was empty. But then, a floorboard creaked outside the door. A deliberate step. I pressed myself back into the corner of the closet, trying to make myself as small as possible, willing myself not to make a sound. My phone felt like it was burning through my palm. I could hear every creak, every shift in the floorboards, like the intruder was just outside, walking slowly, carefully. I was paralyzed, unable to move. Then, the door handle rattled again. It wasn't a jolt this time, but a careful twist, like the person was testing it, making sure it wasn't locked. The door creaked. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't open. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The seconds stretched on forever. The door inched open. I could see the shadow of the figure in the doorway now, a tall man dressed in dark clothing. His hoodie was pulled up, obscuring most of his face, but his presence filled the room. His head moved slightly as he scanned the room, looking for anything that might indicate I was in here. I stayed completely still, too afraid to even blink. Then he moved further into the room, stepping with deliberate slowness as if he was savoring the hunt. He was holding something metallic in his hand. Maybe a knife, maybe a crowbar. I couldn't tell from where I was hiding. It gleamed faintly in the dim light of my room. I could feel the air in the closet getting thicker, like it was pressing down on me. My chest felt tight, and I had to fight the urge to gasp. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I couldn't move. I couldn't let him know I was in here. Just as he stepped closer to the closet, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a notification from my mom. The sound of the vibration was so loud in the silence, it felt like a gunshot. My heart nearly exploded in my chest. The man froze. His head snapped toward the closet door. For a split second, everything stopped. I could feel my entire body trembling, but I dared not move. I thought for sure he would burst through the door, that he would find me, and then suddenly a loud voice shouted from outside, "This is the police! Come out with your hands up!" The sound of sirens screamed into the house, the flashing blue and red lights spilling through the windows. The man's head whipped around in surprise, his eyes wide with panic. He cursed under his breath and spun around, running for the window. I heard the glass shatter as he climbed through, disappearing into the night. I stayed frozen in the closet, my heart racing, waiting for the sound of his footsteps to fade. It took what felt like forever before I dared to open the closet door. When I finally did, I could hear the police officers shouting in the house, clearing the rooms, shouting orders. They stormed into my room, their guns drawn. They never found the guy. He had vanished into the night. I gave my statement to the officers, but they never caught him. Weeks went by without any updates. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my thoughts. My parents came home early after the break-in, and we spent the next few days talking about what happened. They installed a security system, and from then on, I was never home alone again. I should have left earlier. That thought kept circling in my head as I drove through the empty stretch of highway, the glow from my dashboard the only light besides my headlights. It was a mistake, staying so late at my uncle's place. But you know how it is. Family catches up, conversations stretch, and before you know it, the sun's gone and you're 6 hours from home with nothing but the road ahead of you. I had driven this route before, but never this late. It felt different at night. Out here in the middle of central California, the landscape was mostly farmland, huge open fields that stretched for miles, broken up by the occasional barn or solitary gas station. At night, though, those same fields turned into an abyss, a black nothingness that pressed the car windows. I checked the time, 12:47 a.m. My phone sat in the passenger seat, its screen dark, no service. It had dropped to 0 bars about 20 minutes back, and I hadn't seen another car in even longer. The road stretched ahead, smooth and uninterrupted, disappearing into the distance. The yellow lane dividers flickered under my headlights, the only sign of life in an otherwise dead landscape. No streetlights, no houses, just endless miles of 2-lane highway, flanked by thick rows of trees and stretches of dry grass swaying in the night breeze. I turned up the air conditioning to keep myself alert. The cold air blasted against my face, but my eyelids still felt heavy. Maybe I should pull over, just for a few minutes. But the idea of stopping out here in the middle of nowhere didn't sit right with me. Something about the absolute silence, the way the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, made my stomach knot. I shook off the thought and tightened my grip on the wheel. Then, a sudden jolt. The car lurched to the right, the steering wheel yanking in my hands. A loud, rhythmic thud-thud-thud echoed through the night. I cursed under my breath, heart slamming against my ribs as I fought to keep the car steady. I eased onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as the vehicle shuddered to a stop. For a few seconds, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I exhaled sharply and forced myself to move. I grabbed my phone, still no signal. Of course. Sighing, I pushed open the door and stepped out into the night. The air was cooler than I expected, crisp and dry, carrying the faint scent of dirt and hay. The silence out here was suffocating. No insects, no wind, just the distant hum of the cooling engine and my own uneven breathing. I walked around to the passenger side, my shoes crunching softly against the gravel. When I reached the rear tire, my stomach sank. Flat. Completely shredded like I had run over something sharp. I ran a hand through my hair, already knowing what I'd see when I checked the trunk. But I still went through the motions, popping it open, pushing aside my duffel bag and the random junk I had back there. And there it was, my spare. already flat. I stared at it for a long moment, the reality of my situation settling in. No service, no other cars, no way to fix the tire. I was stranded. I leaned against the car, rubbing my temples. Maybe if I waited, someone would pass by, maybe. But deep down, I knew how empty these roads were at this hour. Then, faint in the distance, I saw them. Headlights. A single pair growing brighter as they approached. I straightened, squinting against the glare as the vehicle rumbled closer. It was an old farm truck covered in dust, the kind you'd expect to see rolling through fields, not cruising empty highways in the middle of the night. It slowed as it neared, the headlights washing over me, momentarily blinding. The engine rattled loudly, an old, tired sound. The truck came to a stop just ahead of my car. For a long second, nothing happened. The cab sat in darkness, the driver hidden behind the glare of the headlights. Then, the driver's side door creaked open. A man climbed out, his silhouette tall and lean against the light. He walked forward slowly, hands resting casually at his sides. As he stepped into view, I got a better look at him. Middle-aged, weathered face, deep lines around his mouth and eyes. He wore an old flannel, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing tanned forearms. His jeans were worn, stained with dirt, and his boots were scuffed, dust clinging to the leather. His expression was neutral, maybe even friendly. But something about his eyes put me on edge. They were dark, a little too still, like he was studying me just as much as I was studying him. He stopped a few feet away, hands still relaxed at his sides. "Got yourself a bad night for a flat, huh?" His voice was calm, steady, a little too steady. I forced a chuckle, shifting my weight. "Yeah, guess so." His eyes flicked toward my car, scanning it briefly before settling back on me. "No spare?" I shook my head. "Got one, but it's flat too." A pause. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate, like he was considering something. "Well," he finally said, "nearest station's a ways up. Ain't much traffic this late." I swallowed. "Yeah," I figured. "I can give you a lift," he offered. "Get you to a phone." Silence stretched between us. I glanced down the road. Empty. Just miles and miles of darkness stretching in both directions. I didn't want to get in that truck, but what choice did I have? The man must have noticed my hesitation because he gave a small chuckle. "Ain't gonna leave you out here, kid. Just to the station. No trouble." Something about the way he said that, "no trouble," made my skin crawl. But I forced myself to nod. "Yeah, all right." He reached over and popped the door open. The inside of the truck smelled like dust and old leather, mixed with something else, something faint, metallic. I climbed in, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The seat was worn, the kind of wear that only comes from decades of use. The dashboard was cracked, the radio missing, wires exposed where it used to be. The door shut with a heavy clunk, sealing me inside. And then we started driving. The truck rattled as we pulled back onto the road, its headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, resting my hands on my knees to keep them from fidgeting. The old leather seat creaked beneath me as the truck bounced over uneven pavement. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the faint whistle of wind seeping through the cracked window, and the occasional rattle from the truck bed behind us. I glanced out the window, trying to get my bearings, but something felt off. I had been on this highway for hours before I broke down. I knew it well. It was a straight shot through the valley, with no turns for miles. But now, the road was changing. The smooth asphalt had given way to something rougher, bumpier. I realized we weren't on the highway anymore. At some point, without me noticing, the man had turned onto a smaller, unmarked road. The endless rows of trees lining the highway had disappeared, replaced by wide open fields. The only light came from the truck's high beams, illuminating a narrow dirt path that stretched ahead, winding through what looked like farmland. No streetlights, no signs. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay casual. How far is this station?" The man didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was tight, forced. Not much farther. A chill crawled up my spine. I turned my attention to the side mirror, trying to see behind us. But the truck's taillights cast an eerie red glow against the dust we were kicking up, making it impossible to tell how far we'd gone, or if we could even turn back. I needed to stay calm. If he noticed my fear, I didn't know what he'd do. I forced a small laugh. Guess I don't remember this road. Thought I knew this area. The man chuckled, shaking his head. Most folks don't. He didn't elaborate. My fingers tightened on my jeans. I glanced down at my phone. Even though I already knew, still no service. Stay calm. Stay in control. I turned my attention to the truck bed. The faint glow from the dashboard let me see just enough. A heavy tarp covered something large, something irregularly shaped. And at the very edge of the fabric, a stain. Dark. Dried. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. The truck slowed slightly as we hit another rough patch of road. My heart pounded as an idea formed. If I had to, I could jump. It wouldn't be easy. The truck was still moving fast, and I'd probably hurt myself. But the alternative, I didn't want to think about that. I reached for the door handle, testing it carefully. Locked. I forced myself to breathe normally. I couldn't panic. Not yet. The man's voice cut through the silence. You ever think about how easy it is to disappear out here? My blood ran cold. I turned my head slowly. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were fixed on the road, but there was something different about his expression now. Something darker. My throat felt tight. What do you mean? He smirked. Just saying, he continued, his voice unnervingly calm. Lot of land out here. Miles and miles of nothing. A man could scream and no one would ever hear. He let that hang in the air for a moment like he was waiting for me to react. I forced another laugh, too high, too shaky. Yeah, guess so. The truck rolled on. The road had become even rougher now, more uneven. And that's when I felt it. My chance. The truck hit a deep pothole, jolting hard enough to make the tires briefly leave the ground. I moved instantly. I yanked the door handle again, harder this time. The lock didn't budge, but the jolt had knocked the manual lock slightly loose. I seized the moment, pulling it up with my fingers. The truck hit another rough patch, and I braced myself. Then I threw the door open and jumped. The moment my feet left the truck, I knew it was going to hurt. I hit the ground hard, my right shoulder slamming against packed dirt before my body twisted and rolled. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, pain flaring in my ribs, my knees scraping against the rough gravel. For a second, I couldn't move, just lay there, gasping, staring up at the night sky as dust settled around me. Then, the truck's tires screeched. I barely had time to react before I heard the driver's door swing open. I forced myself up, ignoring the stabbing pain in my leg, and stumbled forward, my boots kicking up dirt as I broke into a sprint. Behind me, the man's voice rang out. Hey! I didn't look back. My feet pounded against the uneven ground, the tall, dry grass slapping against my legs as I ran. I could hear him behind me, the heavy thud of boots hitting the dirt. I pushed forward, weaving through the field, my breath ragged. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, nothing but acres of farmland under the pitch-black sky. No fences, no signs, no roads, just an ocean of dead grass and the distant silhouette of trees. But then up ahead I saw it, a structure, a small cabin, barely visible in the dark. A faint light glowed from inside. I ran harder, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs, my vision blurring with sweat and dust. The house was my only chance. Behind me, the man's footsteps slowed. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He had stopped, just stood there, watching. I turned back toward the cabin, pushing forward until I hit the porch steps. I nearly collapsed against the door, pounding my fists against the wood. Please, help! Open up! For a moment, nothing. Just silence. Then, shuffling. A bolt slid back. The door creaked open an inch, revealing the face of an older man, maybe in his 60s. His eyes flicked between me and the darkness behind me. "Please," I gasped, clutching the doorframe. "Someone's after me. Call the police." He studied me for a moment. Then he nodded once and pulled the door open. I stumbled inside, collapsing against the nearest wall. The man shut the door quickly, locking it with shaking fingers. I pressed my back against the wood, my body still trembling. My pulse was a roar in my ears, my breath coming in short, painful bursts. The cabin was small, just a single room with an old couch, a cluttered kitchen counter, and a table covered in papers. A dim lantern flickered in the corner. The man picked up an old rotary phone, dialing quickly. I heard the faint click of the receiver as he spoke, his voice urgent. "Yeah, I got someone here. Says he's being chased." He glanced at me. "What's your name, son?" I tried to answer, but my throat was too dry. I swallowed hard. "Jake." "Name's Jake," he repeated into the phone. "We're at my place. Yeah, hurry." He hung up, then finally he turned to me. "What happened?" I shook my head, still catching my breath. I got a flat. Guy picked me up. He wasn't taking me to a station. He turned off the road, started saying weird things. I swallowed. There was something in his truck bed, something under a tarp. It had stains. The man's face darkened. He ran a hand over his stubbled chin, exhaling through his nose. "That truck," he murmured. Something about the way he said it sent a fresh wave of chills through me. I sat up straighter. "You know him?" He hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. "There've been stories," he said slowly, "for years." I stared at him. He sighed, leaning against the counter. "Folks go missing out here sometimes, people passing through, not often, just every now and then." My skin prickled. "They say a man in an old farm truck offers him a ride, says he'll take him to a station, but..." His voice trailed off. I felt a sickening weight settle in my stomach. "What happens to them?" The old man didn't answer right away. He just shook his head. "Thing is," he muttered, more to himself than to me, "no one ever remembers his face." I blinked. "What? People that get away. The few that do. They can never describe him. Not really. Just that he looks plain like anyone." He sighed. "And that truck, it never turns up. Never." A cold shudder ran through me. A distant sound echoed outside, the faint whoop of approaching sirens. The old man exhaled. "Cops are coming." I didn't move from my spot against the door. I felt frozen. My mind stuck replaying the moment I had looked back. The sirens grew louder, red and blue lights flashing through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I should have felt relieved, but all I could think about was what the old man had said. How no one ever finds the truck. How no one ever remembers the man's face. And as the police pounded on the door, their voices shouting through the cabin, I realized something. I couldn't remember his face either. It was a typical Tuesday night, or at least that's how it felt at first. I had just gotten home from work around 9:30 p.m. after a long day of meetings and reports, and I was already exhausted. I live alone in a small, one-bedroom apartment in a fairly quiet complex in Dallas. Nothing special, but it's my space. The complex is old but decently maintained, with the usual amenities: a pool, a laundry room, and the ever-present hum of neighbors coming and going. The apartment is on the third floor, which I liked for the privacy. The day had been full of little annoyances. I had a weird encounter at the grocery store, an older man who wouldn't stop staring at me, making me feel uncomfortable, and the drive home had been tedious with endless traffic. By the time I walked through my front door, I was drained. I kicked off my shoes, left my keys on the kitchen counter, and went straight to the bathroom to wash up. I threw my clothes in the laundry basket, changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt, and made a beeline for the couch. I turned on the TV to distract myself for a while, but I quickly found myself dozing off. It was the kind of sleep where your body feels like it's fallen into a void, just floating and nothing feels quite real. I could hear the muffled sounds of cars passing outside, the occasional barking dog, the distant hum of the neighbors in the hallway. I wasn't sure how long I had been asleep when I was abruptly pulled out of the haze by a sound that shot through my drowsy brain like a needle. The loud buzz of the intercom. The noise was shrill and invasive, cutting through the silence of my apartment, and it startled me awake. My head shot up from the couch, my heart pounding in an instant, my eyes blurry with sleep. Still half dazed, I reached over and pressed the button on the intercom without even thinking. "Hello?" I said, my voice thick, my hands still gripping the arm of the couch as I tried to shake off the sleep. A voice crackled from the speaker, low and calm. "This is maintenance. There's been a plumbing issue reported in your unit. I need to come inside to fix it." I blinked, staring at the ceiling as I tried to process the words. I was disoriented, my brain working in slow motion. Plumbing issues? That didn't make sense. I didn't request any work. My apartment had no signs of water damage, no leaks, no strange sounds coming from the pipes. "Plumbing? I didn't request any plumbing work," I responded, my voice a little less confident than I wanted it to be. My eyes darting toward the clock on the wall. It was 2:30 a.m., too late for any sort of maintenance. The voice on the intercom was still calm, but there was something in the way he spoke that made me uneasy. Something insistent. "It's urgent," he said. "There's a problem that needs to be fixed immediately." I glanced around the apartment, my heart thudding faster. Urgent? At 2:30 a.m.? Something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and opened the leasing app to check for any work orders. There was nothing. No notifications, no maintenance requests. I checked again, this time more carefully, but still nothing. "No, I didn't request any maintenance," I replied, my voice shaking slightly. There was a long pause. Then the voice on the other end of the intercom seemed to change. It became a little more forceful, more impatient. "I need to come in now. This is urgent. Let me in." The tone was flat, but there was an underlying edge to it that made my stomach turn. The words urgent and "let me in" kept echoing in my mind, making my skin prickle with unease. Why would someone insist on coming in this late at night? Maintenance had always given at least a day's notice in advance, and they certainly wouldn't come barging in without permission. I shook my head, not sure if I was reacting out of fear or common sense, but the decision felt clear. "No, I'm not letting you in," I said, trying to sound firmer than I felt. "It's the middle of the night. I'm not expecting anyone." The voice didn't answer immediately, but I could hear a slight shift, like he was annoyed. The pause was followed by a quick, sharp exhale. "Look, I'm not here to argue," he said, his voice growing more insistent. "I need to come in. Now." I felt a cold dread slip down my spine, my blood running cold. A heavy weight settled in the pit of my stomach. Why was this man so aggressive? The complex wasn't supposed to have any emergencies like this, and the whole thing didn't sit right with me. That's when it happened. A loud, violent bang erupted from the door. The entire frame shook, and my heart nearly stopped. I jerked backward, my breath catching in my throat. The noise was so sudden, so forceful, it took me a moment to even comprehend what it was. Another loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of a hand rattling the door handle. It was as if the man was trying to break the door down. The noise was so jarring that I froze, unable to move. My breath hitched in my chest, and I felt lightheaded. I stumbled back. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 as quickly as I could. My voice was low, barely above a whisper when the dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone at my door, I whispered frantically. They say they're from maintenance, but I didn't ask for anything. They're pounding on my door. They're trying to get in. Stay inside and lock the door, the dispatcher said calmly. The police are on their way. Stay on the line with me. The pounding suddenly stopped. I froze. The silence was deafening. The tension in my chest was unbearable. What had just happened? Had he given up? Was he still out there? I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath, waiting for any sign of movement, but the apartment remained eerily quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy and muffled in the hall outside. The sound of shoes dragging against the worn carpet echoed faintly. I stayed in the corner of the living room, my phone gripped tightly in my hand, eyes glued to the door. Every few seconds, I would peek through the peephole, but all I saw was darkness. Minutes felt like hours. But eventually, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet of the apartment complex. The police arrived and I rushed to open the door for them. The officers were alert, scanning the hallway with practiced eyes. They asked me to step outside, just in case the man was hiding nearby. "Do you see anyone?" one of the officers asked as he walked the length of the hallway. I shook my head, still too shaken to speak. "We'll check the area," the other officer said. I couldn't help but notice the look in their eyes, like they'd seen things like this before. But the man had disappeared by the time they arrived, and there was no sign of him anywhere. The next morning, I went straight to the leasing office to get some answers. But when I asked about the plumbing issue, the manager seemed confused. No maintenance was scheduled for your unit, she confirmed. You didn't request anything, and we didn't send anyone. I left the office feeling numb. That's when I stumbled across an article online. A woman just a few miles away had been attacked after letting a man into her apartment who had claimed to be from maintenance. That was when it hit me. What had just happened wasn't a coincidence. The man outside my door, the one who had pounded on it with such force, had been the same one who attacked that woman. The realization was cold, sinking into my bones. I immediately installed extra locks and a security camera. I don't know who that man was or why he came for me, but I'm terrified of the thought that he could come back. The fear lingers, a constant, silent presence in the back of my mind. My name's Rachel, and I'm an artist. I've always had a love for painting, capturing scenes that make people pause, that make them feel something deep inside. For years, I lived in a cramped apartment in the city, surrounded by noise and distractions, but I wanted something different. I wanted to find a place that was peaceful, a place where I could paint freely without the constant hum of traffic or the hustle of the city. That's when I found this old house out in the Texas countryside, just on the outskirts of a small town. It was perfect. The house was small but charming, a classic mid-century ranch style with whitewashed bricks and large windows that let in lots of sunlight. It had a weathered wooden porch with a swing that creaked every time the wind picked up, a backyard that stretched for what felt like miles, and a deep sense of quiet that wrapped itself around you like a blanket. The kind of place where you could hear the wind rustling through the mesquite trees and the sound of cicadas in the summer evenings. It was just the change I needed. I moved in quickly, not caring about the small details like faded paint or a few cracks in the floorboards. The important part was the space. I set up my art studio in the spare bedroom. Every morning, I would sit by the window and stare out at the wide, open backyard. The yard was overgrown with native Texas grasses and dotted with wildflowers. I found comfort in the stillness, and my creativity flourished. The neighborhood was quiet. There were a few houses nearby, spaced out far enough that I couldn't see them from my windows, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me and the open land. I spent my days working on my art, mostly abstract pieces inspired by the natural world around me. But after a few weeks of living in the house, I started to notice something that I couldn't explain. Every morning when I made my coffee and glanced out of the kitchen window, I'd see something that made me hesitate. Footprints. At first, I thought maybe they were animal tracks, maybe a stray dog had wandered into the yard. But no, it wasn't a dog. These prints were far too large, and they were human-shaped. Heavy, broad prints, like someone with big boots had walked around the yard overnight. The strange thing was, the prints weren't scattered around the yard. They were always near the windows, always in the spots where I had been working. The back door, the kitchen window, the windows of my art studio. Every single time I looked out, there were fresh footprints, as if someone was walking right outside, watching me. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor, a rancher, or someone living nearby. But the more it happened, the more uneasy it made me, as if the frequency of it all just didn't feel right. I decided to let it go, assuming I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was just adjusting to the new place, and the silence of the countryside was messing with my head. It didn't help that I was trying to keep up with my art career, dealing with the stress of deadlines and constantly adjusting to life in a new place. Still, every morning, the prints would be there, just outside my window. It was a Friday when I decided I'd had enough. The prints were getting too frequent, and they weren't just in the yard anymore. I'd started finding them on the porch, too, right by the door. I had been in and out of the house all day, and no one had been there when I'd stepped out. I could feel the air change at night, too. It wasn't the usual peaceful Texas evening. No, this felt different. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes you feel like you're stuck in a hot, wet blanket. I would go outside just to check the yard, and the oppressive stillness would settle over me. The trees swayed gently and the leaves rustled, but it was the silence that got to me, the way everything else around me felt still, too still. That afternoon, I went out with a cup of iced tea, trying to cool off. As I walked across the porch to the backyard, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A footprint. But it wasn't just any print. It was fresh. The dirt had been disturbed recently, as if someone had just stepped there. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. I stood there for a long time, staring at the print, my iced tea growing warm in my hand. The more I looked at it, the more my mind raced. I hadn't been outside. No one else had been here. I walked slowly to the back of the house just to see if the print led anywhere. But then something caught my eye. There, just by the side of the shed, there was another print, leading up to the side of the house, stopping right by the window of my art studio. I squatted down to examine it more closely. This one was deeper. The heel was pressed into the soft dirt, the imprint of the toes clearly visible. Whoever had been out there was standing close to the window, close enough that they could have been looking inside. I stood up quickly and backed away from the window. It hit me then. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been out there, at the windows, seeing what I was doing. The thought made my stomach turn. I had been alone, and yet I hadn't been. I decided to call the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. The officers checked the yard, the windows, and the surrounding area, but there were no signs of a break-in. No one had been there recently, according to their investigation. I felt foolish. Maybe it was all in my head. But as the days went on, the prints didn't stop. Every morning, I'd wake up to find new ones. By now, I was getting used to it, used to the sinking feeling that crawled up my spine when I saw them. And that's when I started noticing something even more unsettling. Mr. Harris, the old man who lived a few houses down, had been acting strangely. I had noticed him before, mostly when I was walking to the mailbox or outside on the porch, but lately I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I'd catch him standing across the street, leaning against his fence, staring in my direction. I tried to ignore him. Maybe he was just a lonely old man, looking for something to occupy his time. But when I'd look up from my painting, there he was, always watching. One evening, as the sun began to set, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. I had been feeling restless, unable to focus on my work, and I needed a break. As I walked out to the back porch, I glanced toward the street. There he was again, standing at the edge of his yard, staring straight at me. This time, though, his gaze wasn't just idle. It was intense, almost predatory. I quickly stepped inside, shutting the door behind me, my heart pounding. I had been living here for over a month now, and nothing had ever felt this wrong. The prince, Mr. Harris, the strange way everything felt too quiet. It was all too much to ignore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the creaks of the house settling, the occasional rustling of branches against the windows. But there was something else too. A sound. A faint tapping noise, like someone was gently tapping on the window. I lay there in bed, still and listening, but I couldn't make out where it was coming from. The tapping stopped after a while, but the sense of unease didn't leave. It was a few days later, in the dead of night, that everything came to a head. I was in bed, trying to sleep, but the fear kept me awake. The moonlight was filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The house was still, too still. Then I heard it. A soft creak, the sound of something moving. My heart thudded as I held my breath, listening. It was coming from the backyard. I slowly crept out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I tiptoed to the window, pulled back the curtains slightly, and peered outside. And that's when I saw him. A tall, thin figure was standing in the yard just beyond the tree line. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his posture, rigid, tense. In his hand, he held something that glinted in the moonlight, a long, sharp object, the blade of a knife. My breath caught in my throat. It was him, Mr. Harris. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But before I could speak, I heard the rustle of footsteps coming closer, then a sharp rap on my back door. I froze. The police arrived just as Mr. Harris tried to force open the door. He was arrested after a brief struggle. The officers found several weapons hidden in his yard, knives, guns, and even a few strange tools buried under the ground near the fence. Mr. Harris had been stalking me for weeks, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make his move. As they led him away, he didn't say a word, just stared at me with cold eyes. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. I was safe. But something had shifted inside me. The peace I had once found in the quiet of the Texas countryside was gone. Every creak of the house, every rustling leaf outside would always remind me of the man who had been watching, waiting. My name's Jenna, and I'm just a college student trying to make a little extra cash. A couple of weeks ago, I got a babysitting job for this well-off family who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in California. Their house was huge, one of those old homes with a lot of character, but also a lot of creaky floorboards and weird nooks and crannies. I had been there before, so I was familiar with it. The house, while beautiful, always gave off a sense of being both charming and slightly eerie. It was the kind of house that had creaky steps and hallways that seemed to whisper with the wind. The couple, Tim and Sarah, were going out for dinner, and they left me in charge of their two kids, 6-year-old William and 4-year-old Lily. They seemed like sweet kids, and everything had been fine at first. I showed up around 6 p.m., had a nice little chat with the parents, and then they left. Sarah gave me all the instructions she normally did, telling me about their bedtime routine, and reminded me to lock all the doors before I let the kids go to bed. I didn't mind. Babysitting wasn't new to me. I had done it plenty of times, and this family was always very nice. They had specific rules, of course, but they were never difficult to follow. It felt comfortable, like any other evening. After Sarah left, I began to settle into the rhythm of the night. By 8 p.m., after a quiet dinner, I had the kids tucked into their bedrooms. William's room was down the hall from the living room, and Lily's was just next to the kitchen. I was in the living room, on the couch, watching some mindless TV to pass the time. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the low whistle of wind through a gap in the window. The house was old, but I always thought it added to its charm. Tonight, though, it felt colder somehow. Not literally, just this weird, unsettling feeling, as though something was slightly off in the air. That's when I started hearing it. Soft footsteps, slow, methodical, like someone was walking across the upstairs hall. My heart skipped. I glanced at the staircase leading upstairs. The house was old and the stairs always creaked, but this was different. The sound didn't fade like usual. It was almost like someone was walking deliberately just above me. I checked the kids' rooms. Both were fast asleep. There was no reason for anyone to be upstairs. I figured maybe it was the wind. The house had a lot of weird noises, after all. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I had spent a lot of time in old houses and knew that they often had a life of their own when it came to strange sounds. The walls settled, the wood groaned, and there were always creaks and moans as the house shifted. I tried to dismiss it and focused back on the TV, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. But then it happened again. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. I froze. My body tensed as I tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. I had been so sure that no one was upstairs. My stomach twisted in knots. The house was empty, except for me and the kids. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the house settling, but the sound kept going, each step more pronounced than the last. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The footsteps stopped. I didn't hear anything for what felt like forever. Holding my breath, I stared at the staircase, trying to see if anything moved in the shadows at the top. Nothing. No figures, no movement. It was just the shadows, stretching and distorting with the dim light from the hallway. Maybe I was just imagining things. Then I heard something else. The faintest sound of a door creaking open upstairs. It was the kind of sound you only hear when something heavy shifts on a hinge, a soft but distinct groan that made my skin crawl. I felt my heart race. My mind was racing even faster. There was no way I was hearing things. There was someone in the house. I rushed to the kids' rooms, my pulse pounding in my ears. I pushed open William's door, then Lily's. Both were still asleep, blissfully unaware of whatever was happening outside their doors. I couldn't let them stay in their rooms alone. I couldn't risk them being caught in whatever was going on upstairs. I had to act, and I had to act fast. I woke them both up, my voice shaky, but trying to sound calm. "Hey, sweetie, we need to go somewhere safe, okay?" I didn't wait for them to fully register what I said. They were still drowsy and confused, but I bundled them together, grabbing their blankets, and then hurriedly locked ourselves in one of the rooms with a sturdy deadbolt. The walls felt like they were closing in around me as I secured the door. Shaking uncontrollably, I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly dial 911. The screen kept blurring, and my fingers felt numb. It was like time was moving too slowly, and my brain couldn't keep up with the panic rising in my chest. The dispatcher picked up, her voice calm and detached, a stark contrast to the terror running through me. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in the house, I whispered urgently, trying to keep my voice steady. I think they're upstairs. I'm with 2 kids. I don't know who it is, but they're not supposed to be here. Stay where you are, she said, her voice a bit too calm for my liking. We have officers on the way. Can you lock all the doors and stay quiet? I tried to focus on what she was saying, but every minute felt like an eternity. My heart raced, each beat thundering in my chest as I huddled in the room with the kids. Their soft breathing in the dark, unaware of the danger outside the door, was the only thing keeping me grounded. But even that did little to settle the knot of fear in my stomach. I kept staring at the door, straining to hear any sound, anything that would tell me what was happening out there. The silence stretched on, becoming unbearable. The house, which usually felt cozy and inviting, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards outside the room, every wind gust rattling the window, seemed to amplify my fear. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps. How long had they been going on? How long had someone been upstairs? I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I just had to wait, hoping the police would get here in time. The sound of sirens finally reached my ears, and I felt a wave of relief. At last, I wasn't alone. The officers arrived quickly, and I heard them pounding on the front door. I didn't move until I heard them announce themselves. "Jenna, are you okay?" A man's voice called from the front door. I bolted to the door and flung it open. My legs felt weak beneath me, but I forced myself to stand tall as the officers moved quickly, sweeping through the house room by room, their flashlights slicing through the shadows. One of them ascended the stairs first while I stayed behind with the others, holding the kids close and silently pleading that everything would turn out all right. Minutes passed before we heard a shout from upstairs. The officers descended soon after, dragging a disheveled man down the stairs. He was thin, his clothes tattered, his face smeared with dirt. His matted hair suggested he hadn't bathed in weeks. The man looked dazed, almost as if he didn't fully understand where he was or what was happening. "He's been living in the attic," one officer explained, his voice calm but with an edge of disbelief. I couldn't believe it. How long had he been hiding up there? Had he been watching us this whole time? The thought made me shudder. Officer arrested him and led him away, his handcuffs clinking with every step. I stared after them, still trying to process what had just happened. The relief washed over me in waves, but the lingering feeling of violation was something I knew I wouldn't shake for a long time. I looked down at the kids, both of them wide-eyed and frightened, but still safe. I held them close, whispering that it was okay, that everything was fine now. Though I comforted them as best I couldn't help but feel that the image of that man lurking in the darkness would stay with me long after that night. It was a chilly Friday evening in a quiet California suburb, the kind of evening where the air feels a little too crisp, but not enough to make you want to grab a jacket. The sky had started to darken by the time I got home from school, and the house felt emptier than usual. My parents had decided to go visit my aunt for the weekend, leaving me to fend for myself. I had always enjoyed being alone, no one to tell me what to do, no rules to follow. I figured it would be the perfect opportunity to binge watch some movies, eat snacks, and just relax. I was 17, just a regular high school junior, and home alone for the next 2 days. It was about 7:30 p.m. when I finally settled in on the couch in the living room, surrounded by blankets. I set up my laptop in front of me, opened a bag of chips, and popped open a can of soda. I had my usual playlist queued up. Nothing too exciting, just some old-school horror movies. They weren't exactly scary anymore, but they were comforting in a way. As the opening credits rolled, I leaned back and sighed contentedly, enjoying the peacefulness of being alone. It was the perfect kind of night. But then, just as I was reaching for another handful of chips, I noticed something odd through the corner of my eye. It was faint at first, just a flicker of movement. I glanced outside the window, which looked out onto the driveway and street. A dark sedan was parked at the end of my driveway. The headlights were on, but there was no one getting out. The engine was still running, and the car sat there in the dimming light. At first, I brushed it off. It could be someone lost, right? Maybe a delivery driver or someone waiting to pick someone up. I wasn't too worried about it, but something about the situation felt off. I stood up, walked over to the window, and peered through the blinds. The car was parked in the same spot, and no one had gotten out. I couldn't see anyone inside either, and it was starting to get darker, so it was hard to make out the details. The headlights had been turned off by now, and the car sat idling in the dark, almost like it was waiting for something. I shook my head, trying to focus back on my movie. It was probably nothing, just some random driver doing their own thing. I didn't need to let it bother me. I checked the time. It was 9 p.m. now, and I had been so absorbed in the movie that I hadn't even noticed the time pass. The car was still there, but I thought maybe I was just overthinking things. After all, it wasn't unusual to see someone stop for a few minutes in a quiet neighborhood. I walked over to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water, and checked the front door lock out of habit. I didn't know why I was feeling so uneasy, but the moment I reached the door, I noticed my hands were slightly shaking. Trying to brush off the odd sensation, I locked it and headed back to the living room. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept glancing out the window, and there it was again. The car was still there, sitting idle, and there was still no movement. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just someone waiting for someone to pick them up, or maybe a lost driver. I even convinced myself I'd seen it wrong and that maybe the car was just turned off now. But no, it was still there. With a sigh, I locked the blinds and checked all the other doors, front, back, and side, just to make sure everything was secure. It was a habit. My parents were always paranoid about locking up the house, and I guess I'd absorbed some of that from them. It felt like hours had passed when, finally, I heard the car rev up and slowly drive off. A breath of relief passed through me. I watched from the window, making sure it had really left. Once the car was out of view, I allowed myself to relax. I decided to call it a night. Maybe the movie had been too boring, or maybe the whole situation with the car had left me on edge. Either way, I was ready to get some sleep. I grabbed my blanket from the couch and walked down the hallway to my room, tossing the half-eaten chips bag into the trash as I passed by the kitchen. Just as I reached my door, I heard something. A faint, soft noise. My breath caught in my throat. I paused for a moment, straining to listen. It wasn't very loud, but it was definitely there. A soft, scraping sound, almost like something was being dragged across the ground. It was coming from outside. I froze. It was so quiet that I wasn't even sure I had really heard it, but then it happened again. The scraping noise was clear now. I hurried to the window in my bedroom and slowly parted the blinds. I tried to keep my movements slow, cautious. The backyard was dark, the lights on the porch casting faint shadows on the ground. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the grass rustled under the weight of the wind. The only other sound was the distant hum of traffic a few streets over. Then I saw him. A man crouched low to the ground just outside the back patio door. He wasn't close enough for me to make out his features, but I could see the dark outline of his body against the backdrop of the night. He was motionless, his body unnervingly still. He didn't seem to be doing anything in particular, just watching the house. Waiting. My stomach dropped. I wasn't sure what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, my head spinning. I needed to call someone, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. What if he saw me looking? What if he knew I'd spotted him? I felt trapped. My phone was on my bed, but I didn't want to move, not even an inch. I couldn't take my eyes off the man. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, and I whispered into the phone, barely able to contain the panic in my voice. I think someone's outside my house. There's a man in my backyard, and he's just standing there, watching. I heard the operator's voice come through the phone, calm and soothing, but I could hear the urgency behind it. Stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. Can you find a place to hide? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and slowly backed away from the window, trying to make as little noise as possible. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the drawer and moved toward the pantry, the only place in the house that I could think of where I could hide. I shut the door behind me, the cool metal of the knife comforting in my sweaty palms. I crouched down in the darkness, trying to control my breathing. It felt like every small noise in the house was amplified. The soft creak of the floorboards under my feet, the faint rustle of the pantry shelves, my breath that was too loud in the quiet. Outside, the sound of footsteps slowly crunched against the gravel in the backyard. The man was getting closer, and I could feel the tension in my chest building. My heart was thudding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Then came the back gate, the faint creak of it opening. I gripped the knife tighter, trying to stay as still as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer now. Then came the soft jiggling of the back door handle. I sucked in a breath, my hands trembling as I gripped the knife. He was trying to get in. I didn't know what he wanted, but I didn't want to find out. I could barely breathe as I clutched my phone to my chest. "Please," I whispered into it, praying for the operator to reassure me. But instead, she stayed calm and cool, telling me to stay quiet and keep hidden. "Officers are on the way," she said. "They'll be there soon. Stay where you are and stay as quiet as possible." But the seconds felt like hours. I could hear the man shifting outside, moving closer. My skin prickled. I wanted to run, but where would I go? The front door? The back door? My only option was to stay hidden and hope the police arrived in time. Then I heard a loud bang, as if something heavy had been slammed against the door. The man was trying to force it open. The sound made my heart jump into my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to steady myself, to ignore the fear threatening to overwhelm me. The door rattled again, louder this time. I thought I could hear the faint sound of glass breaking, but I wasn't sure. My ears were ringing now, and I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart. The next few minutes felt like a lifetime. Every little sound made my body tense, my muscles aching from the strain of staying so still. Then, finally, I heard it. The glass in the back door shattered. The man was inside. I didn't know what to do anymore. The fear had taken over, and I couldn't think straight. My mind kept racing through endless scenarios of what might happen next. I could hear heavy footsteps moving through the house now, echoing down the hallway. Each step was slow and deliberate, and I could feel it in my chest. He was getting closer. Just then, I heard something in the distance. A faint sound that grew louder. Sirens. The sound of police sirens. I breathed a small sigh of relief, but I didn't move. I stayed as still as I could, hardly daring to make a sound. The sirens grew closer and closer, and then the unmistakable screech of tires on the driveway filled the air. Suddenly, the back door crashed open, and multiple voices shouted orders. "Get down! Get on the ground!" I heard officers swarming the yard, shouting at the man to stop running. He didn't get far. They tackled him before he could reach the back door, and I heard the thud of his body hitting the ground. My stomach turned, but the relief was overwhelming. The police had made it just in time. The officers searched him. I could hear the clinking of metal, the zip of handcuffs being snapped on. He had a knife, zip ties, and duct tape on him. He had been planning something horrible. The officers later told me that he had a history of targeting teenagers who were home alone. He had been watching my house for hours, waiting for the perfect time to break in. If I hadn't called 911 when I did, it could have turned out much worse. As I sat there trying to regain my composure, I couldn't shake the chilling realization. I had never truly been alone that night. The whole time, someone had been waiting, watching me. It wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary, just a road trip, Something simple. My best friend, Dylan, and I had been planning this for a while, a getaway to clear our heads. We didn't have a real destination in mind. The idea was to just drive, let the miles stretch on, and see where we ended up. The freedom of it was the appeal. We were in no rush, no deadlines hanging over our heads. Just two friends driving through Central California at the most inconvenient hour. We left Fresno around 10:30 p.m., the air warm and dry, with that odd, still feeling that you can only get from being deep in the middle of nowhere. Dylan was behind the wheel as usual, with me slouched in the passengers, occasionally glancing out the window at the endless, empty desert landscape. The kind of place where if you didn't keep your eyes peeled, you could almost miss it. The subtle beauty of barren land stretching to the horizon, dark mountains on the far side barely lit by the thin sliver of moon. The highway we were on, Highway 46, felt like a ribbon slicing through the dark. There was no real sign of life here, not a single town or gas station in sight for miles. I had checked my phone a few times, and it was the same story everywhere. No service. In some way, it felt almost peaceful. But there was also a certain loneliness to it that I couldn't shake, a feeling like we were isolated from the rest of the world. The sound of the tires against the road was almost hypnotic, and the silence between Dylan and me was comfortable, not awkward. We'd been friends for years, and most of the time we didn't need to say much. The occasional joke, the odd comment about the road signs or how deserted everything felt, those were the things that filled the space between us. Somewhere around 1 a.m., I noticed the flashing lights in the rearview mirror. Red and blue, barely visible in the dark, but unmistakable once I caught sight of them. The first thing that went through my mind was that we must have been speeding, even though I didn't feel like we were going fast at all. I glanced over at Dylan. His eyes flicked to the mirror too, and I could see his jaw tighten slightly. "Think we're speeding?" I asked, my voice barely cutting through the quiet. Dylan shook his head, his expression unreadable. "I don't think so, but let's pull over, just in case." He eased the car to the shoulder of the road, the tires kicking up loose gravel as we came to a stop. The sound of the engine idling was oddly loud in the otherwise quiet night, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest. I rolled the window down a little more, just enough to hear what the officer had to say. The officer's vehicle parked behind us, a white, unmarked car, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. The silhouette of the officer slowly stepped out, moving toward us. His footsteps were soft but deliberate, the sound of boots crunching over gravel reaching my ears. At first, I couldn't make him out clearly, just a tall figure in the dark, but when he came closer, I immediately noticed something strange. His uniform looked wrong. Not wrong in a way that was obviously fake, but well worn. The fabric was faded, the colors uneven. It didn't fit him properly, like it was too big. Something off. And the badge, when he turned slightly to the light of our headlights, was blank. No insignia, no department name, no number, just a shiny, empty piece of metal. There was something about the way he moved, too. He wasn't walking like most cops do, with that steady, controlled stride. He was stiff, like he was afraid of moving too quickly, or like his body wasn't used to the motion. I glanced at Dylan, who had also caught on to the oddness of it. He gave me a quick look, his brow furrowed, but didn't say anything. The officer didn't speak right away either. He just stood there, staring at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. His eyes, dark, hollow, looked almost too calm, too blank. Then, without warning, he spoke. His voice was eerily flat, like someone reciting lines from a script. "License and registration." There was a pause, and I could feel my heartbeat pick up just a little. Dylan was already reaching for the glove compartment, but I was still staring at the officer, trying to figure out what exactly was off about him. I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to stay alert. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the black void of the desert. There was nothing. I was trying to focus on the officer's face again, but he had started moving slowly, almost deliberately, around the back of the car. I watched him, trying to keep my nerves steady. Something felt wrong. Too wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my instincts were screaming at me to stay alert. "Step out of the car," the officer suddenly commanded, his voice still unnervingly calm. I blinked. There was no reason for us to get out. We hadn't done anything wrong. My mind raced. Why would he ask us to step out? Maybe he thought we were hiding something, but even then, it didn't make sense. I glanced at Dylan. He looked back at me, his eyes wide, the uncertainty clear on his face. "Why do we need to get out?" Dylan asked, his voice tight. The officer didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at us through the window, his hand hovering near his holster like he was waiting for something. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his voice now carrying a sharp edge to it. "Now." I felt my breath catch in my throat. My mind screamed no. It was like a switch flipped in me. This wasn't right. Before I could even react, Dylan's hand shot out and locked the door. The officer's expression didn't change, but his body tensed. Without warning, he yanked on the door handle with a force I didn't think possible. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the car, and for a moment I thought he might break the door open. His face twisted, the calmness completely gone. His eyes were wide now, filled with something darker. "Get out of the car now!" he shouted, his voice a growl. That was all it took. Without thinking, Dylan slammed his foot down on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as the engine roared to life. The sound was deafening, and the force of acceleration threw me back into the seat. I couldn't even catch my breath as we fishtailed down the highway, the headlights bouncing erratically over the empty road. I glanced behind us. In the rearview mirror, I could see the officer still standing there in the middle of the road, not running after us. He wasn't even moving. He just stood there, staring, his dark figure shrinking into the distance as we tore down the road. "Just keep going," I whispered, my voice hoarse, barely audible over the sound of the engine. Dylan didn't need any more encouragement. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white, and pushed the car even faster. The miles blurred past us, but no matter how far we drove, I couldn't shake the image of that officer, standing still, watching us. We didn't stop until we reached a small gas station, barely a blip on the map. The neon lights cast a cold, flickering glow over everything. Dylan pulled in without saying anything, and we both sat there for a minute, just processing what had just happened. I could feel the adrenaline still coursing through me, my hands trembling, and I could tell Dylan was feeling the same way. "Did that just happen?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat tight. Dylan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He was still trying to wrap his mind around it too. "I don't know, man. I don't know." We sat there in silence for another few minutes, neither of us wanting to get out of the car. It was as if the outside world didn't feel safe anymore. We were both looking over our shoulders, glancing nervously at the dark road behind us. Finally, Dylan sighed and got out to pay for gas while I stayed in the car, staring out into the darkness. Every part of me felt on edge, like I was being watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following us, but there was nothing. Dylan returned to the car a few minutes later, and we made the decision to report what had happened to the local police. It was the right thing to do, even if I wasn't sure how much help they'd be. We drove to a nearby station and explained the situation to the officer behind the desk. His face was impassive as we recounted every detail, the strange uniform, the blank badge, the way the officer acted. But when we finished, something changed in the officer's expression. He frowned slightly, as if trying to make sense of what we were saying. "You were on Highway 46, you said?" he asked, his voice suddenly lower, almost cautious. "Yeah," Dylan replied. "That's the one." The officer's eyes shifted, his expression darkening. There were no patrols on that stretch of Highway 46 tonight," he said, his voice low. "And we don't have any units that match the description you gave." I felt my stomach drop. I tried to ask what that meant, but the officer just nodded slowly and said, "We'll look into it." Um, we didn't stick around the station much longer. The last thing I wanted was to be anywhere near this place. And after what the officer had said, I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The police never called us back after that. They never gave us any updates on the investigation. We heard nothing more about the officer, the car, or anything else. It felt like the whole thing had been swept under the rug. I still think about that night. Every time I drive down a deserted highway or see flashing lights in my rearview mirror. I'd like to start by saying that I never thought something like this could happen to me. I mean, I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Texas, surrounded by land and isolation. I was always a practical man. My wife, Rebecca, and I bought this little house on the edge of a dirt road about 10 years ago, thinking the peaceful quiet would be a nice way to raise our two kids, Ellie and Ryan. It's not that we wanted to be out of touch with the world, it was just, well, there's something about the wide open spaces, the land stretching out forever, that makes it feel like nothing can touch you. It gives you this false sense of security, like nothing bad could ever happen in a place this remote. That night, though, the storm hit and everything changed. I can still feel the air that night, thick and oppressive. We were just finishing dinner, a simple meal, something hearty to settle in with, since the weather outside looked like it was about to turn. Rebecca and I sat at the kitchen table while the kids were already heading to their rooms. The old farmhouse kitchen smelled like the stew we'd eaten, a mix of onions, potatoes, and herbs. I remember the smell hanging in the air like it was yesterday, now that it's all gone. After dinner, we did our usual routine, clearing the table, putting away the leftovers, and getting ready for bed. The storm was brewing in the distance, the first distant rumbles of thunder shaking the window panes. It was just before bedtime when the power went out. At first, it was just a flicker, almost imperceptible, but then everything went black. No warning, just a sudden, quiet darkness swallowing the house whole. Rebecca's voice broke the stillness. "Damn it, not again," she muttered. I could hear her stumbling around the kitchen, searching for candles or a flashlight. I chuckled, even though I wasn't in the mood. "It's all right, just another one of those Texas storms." But even as I said it, something about the way the thunder cracked so loudly made me uneasy. The wind picked up, and I could hear it howling through the trees, bending them almost violently. Rebecca sighed. "Yeah, well, you know I don't like the dark. I'll grab some candles. Maybe we should just wait it out in the living room." I reached over and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter, the cool metal of it grounding me for some reason. "I'll go check at the breaker box," I told, trying to sound confident. "It's probably just a short. I'll get it sorted." I could hear her voice, tinged with worry. "Be careful, Tom. It's getting bad out there." I gave her a quick nod, even though she couldn't see me. I pulled on my boots, worn and sturdy, and grabbed my jacket from the back of the door. The cold had started creeping in with the wind, even though it was still warm earlier in the evening. A chill that seemed unnatural, like the storm had a mind of its own. Stepping outside was like walking into a different world. The air was thick and heavy, the smell of wet earth and pine mixing in with the storm. The rain hit the ground hard, splattering and splashing as the wind sent sheets of water lashing across the yard. Everything was blurry. Only the faintest outlines of the barn and trees were visible in the distance. The rain was coming down in sheets, nearly horizontal, and the cold stung my face as I stepped into the muddy yard. The flashlight beam didn't cut through the darkness as much as I wanted it to. I squinted, trying to focus on the barn in front of me, where the breaker box was located. My boots sank a little deeper into the mud with every step, making a sucking sound. The rain was relentless, drenching me within seconds. but I pushed on, determined to get the breaker back on. It was only a matter of time before the storm passed, right? Just a freak outage. We'd had them before, and I'd always gotten the power back on in no time. I could feel the storm getting more intense as I approached the barn. The wind picked up again, now howling so loudly it made my ears ring. I could hear the creaking of the barn's old wooden walls groaning as they struggled to hold against the wind. The breaker box sat on the side of the barn, its metal exterior covered in layers of rust and dirt, a relic from years before I moved here. The handle was cold, slick with rain, but I managed to open it, leaning down to check the switches. And then, out of nowhere, a figure moved in the corner of my vision. It was just there for a moment. A shape, a man, just on the edge of the flashlight's weak beam, like he was standing in the darkest part of the yard, waiting. I could barely make out his outline, but something about him felt wrong, out of place. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it deep in my bones. Before I could even process what was happening, he moved. Fast. I barely had time to react as he lunged at me, a blur of motion. His hand, no, it was a knife, slashed at me, cutting through the air with terrifying speed. My reflexes kicked in just enough for me to raise my arm in defense, but it didn't stop the pain. The blade sliced across my forearm with a sickening crack, and I staggered back, nearly tripping in the thick mud. I barely registered the hot, stinging pain in my arm as I turned and scrambled away, trying to get back to the house. The light from the flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. But as I stumbled backward through the rain, I saw something that made my blood freeze. His eyes. They were cold, like glass, empty. I saw it for a split second, just before he disappeared into the storm. The way he moved, it wasn't frantic, it was deliberate, like this was all planned. I wasn't even thinking straight anymore. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in short, panicked bursts. I needed to get inside. I had to warn Rebecca. The mud slowed me down, and every step felt heavier than the last. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't wrap my head around it. All I could think was, get inside! Get inside, now! I was almost to the door when I heard Rebecca's voice from inside the house. Tom, she called, her voice tight with fear. Tom, what happened? My hand was shaking as I reached for the door. I could barely manage to push it open, and when I finally did, I almost fell inside. I heard the door creak as I slammed it shut behind me, the sound echoing in the stillness. Rebecca, call the cops, I gasped, clutching my forearm where blood was seeping through my shirt. I didn't have the words to explain. I didn't have the strength to make sense of what had just happened. Her face went pale as she looked at me. Oh my God, Tom. She scrambled for the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. The kids, scared by the commotion, had come out of their rooms. Ellie was holding Ryan's hand, her wide eyes locked on me. Mommy, what's going on? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca didn't answer. She just shook her head, keeping her eyes on me, trying to make sense of the situation. I leaned against the wall, breathless, watching her as she spoke to the operator on the phone. My mind was racing, but nothing made sense. The pain in my arm was excruciating, but it was the fear, the cold, absolute fear that made my legs feel like they were going to give out. It felt like I couldn't escape it. Finally, the sirens wailed in the distance. It was a long time before they reached us, but when they did, I couldn't even move. I just watched the blue and red lights cut through the night, flashing against the rain-soaked windows. The officers were quick to respond, sweeping the yard with flashlights, but the man was gone. They found no trace of him, nothing except for the deep footprints in the mud and a few blood droplets where I had been slashed. The sheriff showed up shortly after, his expression grim. Tom, we've had reports of something similar happening in other parts of the county. Families being targeted during storms, home invasions, same pattern. We think it's the same person. The sheriff glanced at me, a silent understanding in his eyes. Be careful, Tom. If it's the same guy, he's been using these storms to cover his tracks. Don't let your guard down. But I didn't need to hear him say it. We had barely escaped him, but somehow, by some miracle, my family was safe. We had made it through the worst of it, and the storm outside felt like a distant worry now. We were shaken, bruised, but together, and that was enough for now. My name is Laura, and I recently moved into a small, quiet house just outside San Antonio, Texas. It's the kind of house that feels like it has a story to tell. It's an old two-story building with peeling paint on the shutters and a front porch that creaks when you step on it. When I first walked through the front door, I could already imagine the cozy nights spent inside, the laughter, and the feeling of finally having a space that was all my own. The house came with a large backyard, which I loved. An expanse of green that stretched out behind the house, bordered by trees and thick bushes. The area was so peaceful. I could hear the wind rustling through the leaves during the day, and at night, the quiet was almost suffocating, but in a good way. I'd always wanted a place like this, far from the noise and distractions of the city. I had just finished unpacking a few days ago, and though there were still boxes scattered around, the house felt like home. To celebrate my move, I decided to invite a few of my closest friends over for a sleepover. I thought it'd be nice to unwind, catch up, and maybe even have a few laughs. There was something comforting about being surrounded by the people who knew me best. I called up Jessica, Alex, and Maria, three of my oldest friends. They were all excited to come, and I could feel the excitement building up in me too. The night started off perfectly. We ordered pizza and settled in the living room surrounded by blankets and pillows. We talked about everything. Old school memories, what had been going on in our lives recently, and our plans for the future. I hadn't realized how much I missed those simple nights of staying up too late, laughing until we were out of breath, and just being together. Around midnight, we started talking about spooky stories, stupid things we'd heard about old houses and creepy legends from our childhoods. We laughed, but as the night wore on, I began to notice something. The air in the house felt different. The temperature dropped just a bit, and the floorboards creaked unnaturally in the silence. The house was settling, sure, but there was something about the stillness that felt off. The light outside had dimmed, and the moonlight filtered through the curtains in the living room, casting long shadows. The sound of the wind rustling outside was barely audible. Everything was still. Too still. At around 2 a.m., we finally decided to call it a night. We were all exhausted, but none of us wanted the evening to end. We reluctantly shuffled to the spare room, where we'd all set up a makeshift bed on the floor with sleeping bags, blankets, and pillows. It was a tight squeeze, but we didn't mind. We were there to have fun, not to be picky. I lay down on my back, staring at the ceiling, my mind still running through all the things we had talked about. The sound of the wind outside had become faint, and the house felt even quieter. The floorboards in the hallway groaned as if responding to the silence, but it was so subtle I might have imagined it. I closed my eyes, trying to push aside the lingering feeling that something wasn't quite right. I turned over onto my side and let the silence wash over me. That's when we heard it. Footsteps. It wasn't a loud sound. It wasn't anything that made us jump out of our skin, but it was there. Soft, almost muffled, like someone walking across the floor above us. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was the house settling, as Alex had suggested earlier, but then the sound came again, this time clearer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy ones, moving deliberately upstairs. My stomach tightened. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. Jessica, who was lying next to me, shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah," she said, sounding confused. "What is that?" Alex and Maria both sat up. looking toward the stairs. "It's probably just the house settling," Alex said again, but this time his voice wasn't as sure as it had been before. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about the sound didn't sit right with me. It was too deliberate, too distinct. It wasn't the creak of old wood shifting under pressure. These were footsteps. Real, human footsteps. We all fell silent, listening. The footsteps continued, slow and heavy, moving from one side of the upstairs hallway to the other. It sounded like someone was pacing. "Maybe one of us left the door open upstairs," Maria suggested, though she didn't sound too convinced herself. I frowned. "No, I locked the door before we came down here," I said. But even as I said it, I felt my stomach twist. We all fell silent again, each of us listening intently. The footsteps stopped. That's when I felt it. The air had gotten colder. The silence that followed felt too thick. We were all lying in the dark, just waiting for something to happen. After a few moments of uneasy silence, we decided to ignore the sound. It had to be the house settling, right? The wind, the temperature, the way the wood creaked, it all made sense. We could have all been imagining things. I tried to get comfortable again, telling myself to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced over at Jessica. She was staring at the ceiling too, her face tense. "I'm just going to use the bathroom," Maria said, breaking the silence. She got up slowly, her movements stiff. "I'll be right back." We all nodded, still unnerved. Maria made her way toward the stairs, her footsteps echoing slightly in the hallway. I listened, the sound of her footsteps fading as she ascended the stairs. The house felt even quieter after that. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Still, no sign of Maria. I rolled over, trying to see the time on my phone, but I didn't want to wake anyone by turning on the light. Where was she? She'd been gone a long time. It wasn't like her to take that long in the bathroom. "I'm going to check on her," I whispered to Jessica. She nodded silently, her eyes wide. "I'll come with you." We both got up and headed for the stairs, trying to move quietly so we wouldn't wake Alex, who was already asleep. The house seemed to have grown even colder since Maria left, and the silence was almost oppressive now. Every small sound seemed louder in the dark. We reached the top of the stairs and I called out, "Maria?" My voice sounded small in the emptiness. "Maria, are you okay?" There was no response. I looked at Jessica, my heart pounding in my chest. "What if something happened?" I whispered. "I don't know," Jessica said, her voice tight with anxiety. We approached the bathroom door. It was closed. I knocked softly at first, then louder, still nothing. I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, but the bathroom was empty. No sign of Maria. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a surge of panic wash over me. Maria wouldn't just leave. She wouldn't just vanish like that. We checked the hallway next, but the only thing I saw was the closed door to the closet at the end. My breath caught in my throat. I walked over, Jessica trailing behind me. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Maria was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall. Her eyes were wide with fear, her body trembling. Her hands were bound behind her, and a rag was stuffed in her mouth. She couldn't make a sound, but her wide eyes said it all. I rushed to her, yanking the gag from her mouth. She gasped, her face pale and tear-streaked. I don't know what happened," Maria whispered, her voice shaking. "Someone was here. They were watching me, waiting for me." Before she could explain further, we heard it again. A door creaking open downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat. The man was still in the house. "We need to get out, now!" I shouted. We helped Maria to her feet and made a run for the stairs. We weren't thinking clearly. We were scared. "Alex!" I whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "Alex! Wake up! There's someone in the house!" He stirred, groggily rubbing his eyes, his face still half asleep, but as soon as he saw the panic in our eyes, his expression shifted to one of alarm. He jumped up, eyes wide. "What happened?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "There's a man in the house," Jessica said, her voice shaky but urgent. "We need to get out now." Without hesitation, Alex grabbed his phone, flicking on the flashlight. He glanced quickly toward the door, and the fear on his face mirrored ours. "Let's go," he said. "Right now." When we reached the front door, I fumbled with the keys, panic making my hands unsteady. My heart raced, and every second felt like an eternity. Finally, I managed to unlock the door, and we spilled out into the yard, gasping for air. The cool night air hit us like a shock, but it didn't do much to calm the terror swirling inside me. We didn't stop running until we reached our neighbor's house. We pounded on the door, the sound frantic, as though our lives depended on it. "Please, call the police," I gasped. "There's someone in my house." The neighbors, clearly confused and frightened, let us inside. We all sat there in silence, waiting for the police. They arrived minutes later, but when they searched the house, there was no sign of the man. The only thing they found was a stash of tools and ropes hidden behind a loose panel in the closet. It looked like the man had been planning to do this for a while. But the most unsettling part, the man was never found. The police told us to be careful and that they would continue looking into it. But the house was empty. To this day, I don't know who that man was, but I'm certain that he was waiting for us to fall asleep. And if we hadn't found Maria when we did, I don't even want to think about what would have happened. It was supposed to be just another Friday night in the middle of a quiet, sleepy suburb in California. You know the kind of night I'm talking about. The kind where the weather feels crisp, like it's on the verge of turning cold, but not quite there yet. The kind where the streets are empty except for the occasional car that zooms past in the distance, their headlights casting long, eerie shadows on the sidewalk. I was 17, and my parents had decided to head upstate for the weekend to visit some old friends. They trusted me, so I was left home alone. It wasn't unusual for me to be home alone for a couple of days. I had a decent amount of freedom. I wasn't doing anything crazy or out of control. I'd planned to spend my weekend gaming, maybe catching up on some schoolwork, and ordering some takeout from my favorite pizza place. The evening started off normal enough. I grabbed the pizza, made sure all the doors were locked, and settled into my gaming chair in my room. The setup was nothing special, just my old computer, a cheap chair, and a half-finished stack of papers on the desk. But the glow from the screen and the comfort of the headphones always made me feel like I could disappear into another world. The sound of my game's soundtrack was all I could hear. I was completely immersed in it. I hadn't even noticed how dark it had gotten. The clock on my screen told me it was around 8:15 p.m. The house was dim, lit only by the flicker of the monitor and the streetlight outside my window, casting strange shadows that stretched long across the walls. The only sounds were the click of my mouse and the steady hum of my computer fan. Then I felt it. It wasn't loud at first. It wasn't like the sound of someone breaking in or anything obvious like that. No, it was just a presence, a feeling, really, that crept up on me. It was like when you're deep in a dream and you suddenly become aware that something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. It started as a cold sensation, a chill that ran up my spine, creeping through my neck and into the back of my head. I stopped playing, lifted my hands from the mouse, and listened. The only sound I could hear was the low hum of my game. But something felt off. I felt a sudden awareness of the room around me, the corners of the room, the darkness beyond the glow of my screen. My heart rate picked up, and I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. And that's when it happened. A cold, firm hand gripped the back of my neck. It wasn't a soft touch. No, it was hard, cold, and unyielding. The kind of grip you would expect from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. My entire body went rigid, a sharp shock of fear and confusion paralyzing me in place. My mind screamed at me to move, to react, but I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. I tried to turn around, but the hand was too strong, pulling me back into my chair, forcing me to face forward, staring at the glowing monitor in front of me. Then, without warning, I was yanked out of my seat, so violently that I barely had time to react. My stomach lurched, and I felt the familiar sting of the floor hitting my back as I crashed to the ground, the air knocked out of me. My vision blurred, and I could feel a sharp pain shooting through my skull. It was like everything around me slowed down, but my body was still moving, rolling, tumbling through the shock. I tried to blink the dizziness away to focus on what was happening, but before I could even think straight, I felt another punch to my face. The pain exploded through my jaw. "Stay down, stay quiet," a voice growled. I could barely process the words through the pounding in my head, but they were clear enough. My body was still shaking, but I was too stunned to scream, to do anything. The next thing I remember is being roughly flipped onto my stomach. My wrists were grabbed, pulled behind my back, and I could feel the cold bite of plastic cutting into my skin as the zip tie was cinched tight. My arms were pressed painfully against the floor, the skin digging into the carpet fibers. I could hear the man's breathing heavy and labored, like he was trying to control his own rage. I could barely see his face, the black ski mask covering most of it, but I could tell he was focused on me. Then he spoke again, his voice so close I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. "Stay quiet and you won't get hurt," he repeated. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My body felt like it was trembling from the inside out. Every part of me wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but I was trapped, bound, helpless. The man moved away, his footsteps retreating into the hall. I could hear him moving quickly, slamming open drawers, rustling through papers, and overturning furniture. The house felt like it was alive with the sounds of him tearing through it, like he was looking for something. But what? Why me? Panic set in. The more I thought about it, the more my head swirled with possibilities. I couldn't make sense of it. I had no idea what he wanted, what he was after. My heart thudded in my chest. The zip tie cut into my wrists, making it harder to breathe. I had to get out. I had to do something. I glanced around, my mind desperately searching for a way out. My eyes darted to the kitchen. The knife. The one I had left on the counter earlier when I'd made my sandwich. It was my only chance. With every ounce of will I had left, I dragged myself across the floor, wincing at the pain in my arms and legs, feeling the cold grip of the zip ties bite into my skin with every movement. I could hear the man moving around, the sound of drawers opening and closing, his muffled curses echoing through the house. He was too focused on his search to notice me. My heart raced as I reached the kitchen doorway, feeling a strange, almost magnetic pull to the counter. The knife was there. I could see it in my mind's eye, the silver blade glinting in the dim light. It was close enough that I could almost taste the relief, but I couldn't reach it yet. Then I heard another voice, a second figure. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a new presence in the house. It was like a shadow had entered the room with him, and I could hear them whispering, talking about something I couldn't understand. Panic flooded me again. I didn't know how much time I had, but I couldn't stop now. I grabbed the knife. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I worked to cut the zip ties, the blades scraping against the plastic in small, jagged movements. It felt like an eternity, but finally the ties snapped. The relief was immediate, and my arms dropped to my sides. I couldn't think about anything except escaping. I scrambled to my feet, my legs wobbling from the adrenaline and the pain, and I bolted for the back door. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I threw open the back door with all the strength I could muster and dashed out into the cool night air. The grass beneath my feet was cold and damp. the world around me a blur of movement and frantic thoughts. My bare feet slapped against the pavement, and I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps behind me. They were close. I didn't have time to think, to plan. I could only run. I ran past my yard, across the narrow street, and up to Mr. Whitaker's house. He was a retired cop, lived next door. My knuckles ached from the pounding I did on his door. It took him a moment to answer, but when he did, his face was a mask of concern. "Ethan? What's going on?" he asked, his voice firm but worried. "They're in my house. 2 men. They..." I gasped for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. "They're trying to hurt me. Please help." Without hesitation, Mr. Whitaker yanked me inside and slammed the door behind me. He didn't say a word, just moved quickly, his eyes darting to the window as he reached for something beneath his coat. The cold metal of a gun appeared in his hand, and he moved to the front window, peering through the blinds. Seconds later, I saw them. 2 figures, wearing black ski masks, creeping out of the shadows of my yard. They saw Mr. Whitaker with the gun, and it was like their entire posture changed. They turned, their footsteps retreating quickly into the night. They were gone. The police arrived shortly after, and I gave my statement, but nothing came of it. The men were never caught. They slipped away into the darkness, and no one ever found out who they were. When my parents came home the next day, they were horrified. The first thing they did was change all the locks, install cameras, and make sure the house was completely secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped. It was well past midnight when we finally spotted the motel. The desert highway stretched on endlessly, a long ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. The air was dry, almost suffocating, and the only sound was the low hum of the car engine and the occasional whoosh of the tires against the road. The landscape around us was desolate, miles of flat, barren land with no signs of life, save for the occasional scraggly bush that dotted the empty horizon. The sky was ink black, the stars so bright that they almost seemed close enough to touch. But it didn't make me feel better. If anything, the vastness of it all made me feel small and insignificant. "Jack, I think we need to stop," Natalie murmured, her voice strained from the long drive. She'd been quiet for the last hour, eyes fixed on the road ahead, and I could tell the exhaustion was starting to get to her. I nodded without looking at her, my grip tightening around the steering wheel. I was tired too. The drive had been longer than I expected, and the silence between us felt suffocating, even though we were usually comfortable with it. "Yeah, I know. I'm just hoping we can find something before we run out of road." My eyes scanned the desert around us, but there was nothing. Just the occasional rock and dust. I could feel the weariness in my bones, the kind of tiredness that comes from being in the car too long, surrounded by nothing but open space and dark. It felt like a good hour had passed before we saw anything that resembled civilization. A dim, flickering sign in the distance, glowing pale yellow against the night. A faded, weathered motel sat just off the highway, its neon sign almost illegible. I could see a few cars parked outside, but no one seemed to be moving. The place looked run down still. It was a sign of life, and at that moment, I didn't care what it looked like. We needed to stop. I pulled off the road and into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching against the loose stones beneath us. The parking lot was nearly deserted, save for a few older cars parked in different spots, and one rusted, beaten-up sedan sitting at the far end of the lot. And standing by the sedan was a man. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, with a worn leather jacket that looked too big for him. His face was obscured in the shadows, but his posture was rigid, unnaturally still. He wasn't just standing, he was watching us. I could feel his gaze even before I consciously realized it. The way he was staring was almost unsettling. intense, unblinking, as if he was waiting for us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Jack, that guy's staring at us? Natalie whispered from beside me, her voice barely audible. I glanced over at her and she was looking at the man with wide eyes. I didn't respond right away, trying to shrug it off. Probably just another traveler, or maybe someone who works here. I mean, this place is pretty small. It's probably nothing. I wasn't sure if I believed that myself, but I didn't want to scare her more. We both got out of the car, but the man didn't move. He just kept standing there, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on us as we walked toward the motel entrance. My gaze flicked back to him a couple of times as we walked, and I was almost sure he hadn't blinked. I could feel the tension in the air, and it made the walk to the lobby feel longer than it should have. The only sound was the faint crunch of our shoes against the gravel. Inside, the lobby was dark and quiet. The fluorescent lights above flickered every now and then, casting an eerie, sickly glow on the small, cluttered room. The smell of stale air hit me as soon as I stepped through the door. Old carpet, dust, something faintly sour. The clerk behind the desk didn't even look up at us when we entered. He was slouched over, his face half hidden in the shadows, his eyes vacant as he stared at something on the counter. I cleared my throat, but he didn't respond. After a few moments, I tried again, a little louder this time. "Hi, we'd like a room, please." I could hear the uncertainty in my voice, but I still wasn't sure if it was the long drive or the unsettling atmosphere that was making me feel so off. The clerk finally looked up. His eyes were dull, almost glazed over, like he hadn't seen anything in years. Without saying a word, he reached for a key hanging from the wall behind him and handed it to me. The key had a tag with the number 14 written in fading black ink. As I turned to leave, I noticed the man from the parking lot had followed us inside. He wasn't near the counter, though. He stood by the door, just inside the threshold, his gaze fixed on us like he couldn't tear himself away. I don't know why, but it made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if he was just another guest or if he was something else entirely. Natalie must have sensed my unease. She walked a little closer to me, her arm brushing against mine. Neither of us said anything as we made our way to the room. I felt the weight of his stare even though we didn't look back. I could practically feel the man's presence following us as we passed through the lobby and out into the cold night air. Room 14 was just as depressing as the rest of the place. The door creaked loudly when I opened it, and the faint smell of must lingered in the air. The walls were a dull, yellowish color, and the carpet was stained in several places as if it hadn't been cleaned in years. The bed was the worst of it, old and lumpy, the springs creaking beneath me when I sat down to take off my shoes. Natalie dropped her bag onto the bed and started pulling out some things for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stood by the window for a while, looking out into the parking lot below. "Jack? I think I'm just going to lay down for a bit," Natalie said, her voice flat and tired. I nodded but didn't move from the window. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, his unblinking eyes, the way he seemed to be watching our every move. It was like he was waiting for something, but I couldn't figure out what. I tried to shake it off. Tiredness, paranoia, a long day of driving, but it was hard to let go of the feeling of being watched. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke with a start, heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't realized I'd fallen asleep at all, but the sudden sharp sound of something scraping against the door made me sit up, wide awake. It was a soft noise, slow and deliberate. At first I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a stray cat or a rodent. But then came a soft, hollow thud. I looked over at Natalie. She was still asleep, her face soft with the quiet breath of sleep, completely unaware of what was happening. My mouth went dry. I stared at the door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the sound. The sound came again. I felt frozen, but I couldn't not look. I couldn't pull my eyes away from the door. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet barely making a sound on the worn carpet. I tiptoed to the peephole, my breath shallow, and pressed my eye to it. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty, pitch black, no sign of movement. I stood there for a long moment, trying to figure out what had happened. The scraping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than before. Slowly, I backed away from the door, my mind still spinning. The quiet felt suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to check again. So I stayed in place, listening, waiting, and nothing happened. Not a single sound. I lay back in bed, my chest tight. I didn't even realize when I finally drifted off, my eyes still fixed on the door. The hours had blurred together. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the cracks in the blinds, I had already packed our bags. My whole body ached from tension. I didn't care if the place was cheap or that we were exhausted. We were leaving. I was done with this place. As we walked out of room 14 and towards the car, I noticed the police cars for the first time. At least 3 of them were parked in front of the motel, their lights flashing red and blue against the gray morning light. A couple of officers were talking to the motel manager, and one of them was talking to the clerk from last night, who still looked like he hadn't moved from his post. I stopped, confused, my hand instinctively reaching for Natalie's. She squeezed my hand in return, her eyes wide. "Jack, what's going on?" Before I could respond, an officer came up to us. He was tall and lean, with a sharp gaze. "Were you in room 14 last night?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I nodded. "Yeah, we were. Is something wrong?" The officer's expression didn't soften. "You don't realize how close you came. That guy was planning to break into your room." It turned out that the man from the parking lot had been watching us all night. He wasn't just a traveler or a guest. He had been waiting. The police had arrested him earlier that morning after finding out he'd been trying to break into multiple rooms using stolen keys. They had found his car parked a few rooms down, where he'd been lying in wait, watching people, choosing his next target. I felt the blood drain from my face. That man, the one whose eyes had never left us, had been targeting us the entire time. He had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The officer told us they had caught him in the act, just before he could break into another room. The fact that he had been watching us, waiting for us to fall asleep, made everything feel more real, more terrifying than I could have imagined. As I looked at the police cars and the flashing lights, I couldn't help but think about how close we had come to something worse. I've always been someone who values routine. Life in Austin, Texas moves at a quick pace, but there's a certain calmness in my life. At least there was. I'm Mia, a 28-year-old nurse working the night shift at a small community hospital. It's the kind of place where you get to know your patients by name and learn all the quirks that come with caring for people in the middle of the night. Last night had been especially draining. We were short-staffed, and I was on my feet for hours longer than I should have been. By the time I walked out of the hospital's back exit around 11:45 p.m., the city had already quieted down. The streets were calm, the faint hum of passing cars barely audible. I was so tired, I didn't even bother checking my phone for messages or social media updates. The only thing on my mind was getting home and collapsing into bed. My house is small. 1 story, a simple rental in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It's nothing fancy, just a cozy little place with creaky floors, faded yellow paint, and windows that, despite being old, let in just enough sunlight to make the mornings tolerable. The kind of house you don't need to lock up 5 times before bed because you feel safe in it. And it's always been that way. I pulled into the driveway, shut off the car, and grabbed my purse. The night air was cool, the kind that hinted at the arrival of fall. I didn't bother turning on the porch light as I fumbled with my keys, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The familiar scent of my house filled my nose. Freshly cleaned linen mixed with the faint remnants of the lavender-scented candle I'd burned earlier in the evening. Everything felt normal. I locked the door behind me, dropped my purse on the kitchen counter, and headed straight for the fridge. A leftover portion of lasagna was calling my name, so I popped it in the microwave, only half-heartedly stirring it before slapping a lid on it and hitting the button. The sound of the microwave's hum felt strangely comforting in the otherwise quiet house. While the lasagna heated up, I moved into the living room and flopped down on the couch, tossing the remote aside and sinking into the cushions. The soft beige fabric hugged my body as I leaned back and stretched out my legs. I could hear the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the other room, and outside, crickets chirped, the sound of nature's nightly orchestra. I don't know what it is about nights like this, but I always get a little uneasy. Just a general sense of restlessness that doesn't have any real cause. Maybe it's the darkness, the way it seems to swallow everything up. But after a few minutes of zoning out, the microwave beeped and I snapped back to reality. I returned to the kitchen and pulled out the hot lasagna, the steam curling up in a wispy cloud as I plated it. It was delicious, as usual, and I ate it quickly. Exhaustion pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, and by the time I finished, I could barely keep my eyes open. I left the kitchen a mess, but I didn't care. I could clean tomorrow. After all, it's just a couple of dirty plates. I trudged back to my bedroom, kicked off my shoes, and slid into bed without bothering to even pull the covers up. I sank into the soft mattress, feeling the fatigue in every muscle. The silence of the house wrapped around me, and soon I was asleep. I don't know how long I slept. It could have been hours, it could have been minutes. The next thing I remember was waking up with a dry throat, the kind of dryness that makes you feel like you're choking on air. I blinked my eyes open, squinting at the soft glow of the clock on my nightstand, 3:14 a.m. I tried to ignore the dryness, but it wouldn't go away. I could feel the air in my lungs, the weight of it pressing down on me. I rubbed my eyes, the sleep still thick in my head, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My feet touched the cold hardwood floor, and a slight shiver ran up my spine. My room was pitch dark, save for the faint flicker of light from the street lamp outside. Everything was still. I let out a small sigh. The house was silent, too silent. That's when I first noticed it. Something was off. I can't describe it in any other way, but the air felt heavier. I told myself I was just tired, too tired. Maybe I had just woken up from some strange dream. But there it was again, a creeping unease, like the room itself was watching me. I stood there for a moment, blinking in the darkness, trying to shake off the feeling. Then, without thinking, I reached for my phone on the nightstand and unlocked it. Just the usual, no new notifications, no calls. I slid it back onto the table, the screen dimming to black. That's when I decided to get up and go to the kitchen. I needed something to drink. As I walked through the house, I didn't think much of it at first. The floorboards creaked slightly under my feet as I moved through the hallway. The stillness of the house only made the creaks more pronounced. The soft hum of the refrigerator echoed from the kitchen, but it felt louder somehow, more present. I turned down the hallway toward the kitchen, my footsteps quiet but steady when I suddenly stopped. My heart skipped a beat. At the end of the hall, near the bathroom, there was a figure. A tall figure. I couldn't see his face, just a shadowy outline, standing so still that for a moment I thought it was some trick of the light. But then the figure moved, slowly, purposefully. My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. My body froze. I stared at the figure for what felt like a century, my mind trying desperately to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't until I saw the figure move again, this time faster, that my body kicked into gear. I ran. I darted back toward my bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs carrying me faster than I ever thought possible. I didn't even look back as I slammed my bedroom door shut, locking it behind me. The sound of the door frame rattling from the impact was enough to make my blood run cold. The man was right behind me. He wasn't far behind at all. I scrambled for my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice cut through the fog of panic. 911, what's your emergency? She asked calmly. I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight. My body was shaking too much. I could only manage a whisper. There's someone in my house. He's trying to get in. The man on the other side of the door was still, but I could hear him. His breathing was ragged, heavy, like he was winded. Was he trying to hide, or just waiting? I couldn't tell. I couldn't think straight. I could barely make out the sound of the doorknob turning. He was trying to open the door. I held my breath, terrified that any sound I made would let him know I was still in here. And then, just as quickly as it started, it went silent. It felt like hours passed. I clutched my phone to my ear, the line crackling faintly. The silence was suffocating. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. The fear held me in place. The sound of distant sirens brought me back to reality, and I felt a surge of hope rush through me. Police. Help was coming. The minutes felt like hours, but then, finally, I heard the sounds of boots pounding down the hallway. They were here. The police rushed into the house, clearing each room with careful precision. I stayed frozen in place as the officers found him, crouched behind the washing machine in the laundry room. They grabbed him, restrained him, and quickly pulled him away from the house. I later learned that the man had tampered with the back door, which I hadn't noticed. He'd been inside my house for God knows how long, quiet, still, like a shadow in the dark. It haunts me now. The thought that if I hadn't woken up to drink some water, if I hadn't gone down that hallway, I would never have known. I would have slept right through it all, unaware of the stranger hiding just behind the walls, waiting for me to fall asleep so he could strike. It started off as a simple favor, nothing out of the ordinary. I was a 20-year-old college student living in a cramped apartment with a couple of roommates, and my aunt had asked me to house sit for her while she was away for a week-long vacation in California. To me, it sounded like the perfect opportunity. A week in a spacious, quiet house, away from the noise of city life and the chaos of campus. Plus, I could use the extra money. The house itself was a large, two-story building with a big backyard nestled in a suburban neighborhood that felt almost too perfect to be real. I remember driving up to it for the first time, my eyes scanning the rows of neatly manicured lawns, the palm trees swaying gently in the breeze, and the way the sunlight hit the house in such a way that it looked almost too ideal, too picture perfect. It wasn't anything extravagant, but there was a certain calmness to it. The house felt well maintained. My aunt had lived there for years, and as I stood there outside the front door, taking in the sight of it, I started to feel a slight unease that I couldn't quite explain. Still, I brushed it off. I was probably just tired from the drive. After getting the keys from my aunt's neighbor, I let myself inside. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The kind of silence that's heavy, like the air is thick with stillness. The house smelled faintly of lavender, but there was something about it that felt too clean, too pristine. Every piece of furniture in the living room was perfectly in place, every picture on the wall aligned just so. There wasn't a speck of dust anywhere, and everything seemed to be in its exact place. Even the air in the house felt unusually still, as though it had been waiting for something. I set my bag down on the couch and walked through the house, trying to shake off the weird feeling in my chest. The kitchen was just as immaculate, all the dishes neatly put away, the countertops wiped clean. My aunt's kitchen always looked like a model home, nothing out of place. I opened the fridge to grab a bottle of water, and it was stocked with fresh produce and prepared meals. It was all so organized, almost sterile. I couldn't help but notice how everything seemed controlled, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, after I'd unpacked and set up in the guest bedroom on the second floor, I did what I always do before going to bed. I double-checked every lock. I've always had this thing about making sure doors and windows are secure before it gives me a sense of comfort. The back door was the last thing I checked, and that's when I noticed something strange. The latch on the back door wouldn't click into place. I closed it, but when I pushed on it even a little, it would swing back open. It didn't make any sense. I tugged at the handle, trying to force it shut, but it was like the door didn't want to stay closed. After a few moments of frustration, I decided to just shove a chair in front of it, figuring I'd deal with it in the morning. I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. The creaking of the house settling around me was oddly comforting, and soon I drifted off to sleep. The first few nights were completely uneventful. I got into a routine. During the day, I'd spend my time studying or watching TV, and at night, I'd lock up the house and go to bed. The creaks and groans of the house became almost familiar, like the whispers of an old friend. There was something oddly soothing about it, and I began to feel more comfortable, like the house was mine. But then, on the fourth night, things changed. I woke up suddenly in the dark, my body drenched in sweat, the kind of sweat that makes your skin stick to the sheets and your heart race in your chest. The room was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 3:15 a.m. The time didn't help calm my nerves. I tried to ignore the feeling of something being wrong, of something being off. But the more I tried to force myself back to sleep, the more awake I became. It started with a sound, a faint creak, like someone stepping on an old wooden floor. I froze, my ears straining to catch more. I tried to dismiss it as the house settling, the way old houses do, but then it came again. A slow, deliberate creak, followed by another one. It wasn't the sound of something shifting with the weight of time. It was the sound of someone walking. Someone was downstairs. My heart started racing. I could feel the blood draining from my face. I held my breath, trying to stay still, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining it. Maybe I had heard something outside. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again. Another creak, followed by a soft shuffle of footsteps. The sound was unmistakable now. There was someone in the house. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to make any noise. Didn't want to alert whoever it was to my presence. But I also didn't know if I was safe. I didn't even know where they were or how many people were in the house. My mind raced, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I slowly grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands shaking so much that I could barely unlock it. My fingers felt stiff, clumsy. I dialed 911, whispering as quietly as I could into the phone, explaining that someone was in the house, that I was alone and terrified. I was just finishing up the address when something happened that made my heart stop. A knock on my bedroom door. I couldn't breathe. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible, as though I could somehow disappear. The knock came again, soft and measured, but unmistakable. Whoever was on the other side of that door knew exactly where I was. They knew I was there. I had to stay still. I couldn't make a sound. I heard the footsteps again, moving away from my door, the sound of someone pacing. My heart was thudding in my ears. Every little sound felt like it was amplified in the silence. Every creak of the floorboards sounding like a thunderclap in my head. I couldn't tell if the footsteps were moving toward the stairs or away from them. I heard them go down the stairs. The creaks of the steps were loud and distinct in the quiet of the house. The hurried shuffle of footsteps told me they were in a hurry to get away. After what felt like an eternity, I heard nothing but the distant hum of the fridge. The 911 operator was still on the line, asking if I was okay. My mouth felt dry as I finally whispered, "They're gone." The police arrived, what felt like hours later, though it was probably only minutes. I led them through the house, trying to explain everything as clearly as I could, though I could still feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, making it hard to think straight. We went through the upstairs first. Nothing out of the ordinary. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But then, when they opened the basement door, the smell hit me. It wasn't just the musty, stale smell of a basement. It was worse. It was sour and heavy, like something had been left to rot. My stomach turned as the police went down, their flashlights cutting through the dark. The air felt thicker down there, like it was suffocating me. I felt trapped, but I couldn't look away. Then the officers found it. A sleeping bag, ripped and dirty, lay in the corner. Empty food wrappers were scattered around, along with a few cans. A small, dull knife was carelessly discarded nearby. Someone had been living down there. Someone had been hiding in my aunt's house for days, coming and going through the faulty back door. The police searched every nook and cranny, but they found no trace of the intruder. No fingerprints, no evidence of who had been living there, no signs of a struggle. It was like the person had just vanished. They never caught them. My aunt changed all the locks and installed security cameras around the house as soon as I told her everything. But even with all that, the feeling of being watched never went away. I couldn't escape it. I never house sat again. I couldn't. It was late, too late for me to be studying, really, but I had no choice. Finals were coming up, and I needed to cram. I was sitting at my desk in my small off-campus rental in the quietest part of this sleepy Texas town. It was around 11:30 p.m., and the room was lit by a single desk lamp, casting a warm yellowish glow across my cluttered desk. The hum of my laptop was the only sound, the soft, almost imperceptible flicker of the screen illuminating my tired eyes. My notes were strewn across the desk in no particular order. Half of them were scribbled, and the other half barely made sense. But at this point, I was too tired to care. Outside, the trees had started to shed their leaves, and the wind carried a chill. I could hear it whistling through the cracks in the windows, causing them to rattle slightly. The air felt damp, and it smelled like wet earth and fallen leaves, exactly what you'd expect from an autumn night. But there was something about that night, something heavier in the air. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the silence was off. It wasn't the usual quiet of a sleepy neighborhood. It felt almost like the calm before a storm. I tried to push the feeling away and focus on my studies, but then it happened. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft scraping. I figured it was nothing, probably just an animal brushing against the side of the house, or maybe a branch caught on the window. I didn't think much of it. The sound continued, though, and it seemed to grow a little louder. It wasn't just scraping now. It was more like scratching, something persistent, almost methodical. My brow furrowed, and I looked over at the window, half expecting to see a cat or maybe a raccoon, but there was nothing. The wind outside was still, but the scratching sound kept going. I leaned back in my chair, trying to shrug it off, but my mind kept nagging at me. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too consistent. The longer I sat there, the more unnerved I became. I tried to focus on the notes in front of me again, but all I could hear was that scratching sound. It was coming from the front door. I stood up slowly, my heartbeat rising. I tried to convince myself it was just some stray animal, maybe a possum or a raccoon trying to get in, But then came the sound that made my blood run cold. The doorknob rattled. At first, I thought it might just be the wind again. Maybe the breeze had picked up and was shaking the door a little, but then the rattle came again, more forceful this time. My entire body tensed, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone was at my door. I froze. For a second, I couldn't move. My heart thudded in my chest as I stood there, listening to the metallic rattle of the doorknob. My first thought was to call the police, but the phone felt miles away. I stumbled toward the door, barely able to keep my balance. I crept toward the peephole, my hand trembling as I reached for it. I squinted through the small circular lens, expecting to see nothing but the dark porch. But there was something there. A shadow. I could barely make out the figure of a person, hunched over, working at the lock on the door with gloved hands. A tall figure, too tall, and the hoodie they were wearing was pulled so low that I couldn't see their face. I pulled away from the peephole quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure outside hadn't noticed me, but the moment I backed away, I knew I had to do something. I glanced back at my phone. I could still dial 911. My hands shook as I picked it up and silently called the dispatcher. I whispered into the phone, trying to keep my voice low. My throat was dry and I could barely get the words out. Someone's at my door. I think they're trying to break in. I was still watching the peephole when I heard it. The lock clicked. The door was opening. Time seemed to freeze for a second. My heart stopped beating. There was no time to think. Panic flooded my body. I darted toward my bedroom, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. My hands were slick with sweat as I grabbed the door handle, wrenching it open. I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew it wouldn't be enough. The door wasn't solid enough to hold anyone back. I quickly pushed my desk against it, hoping it would buy me enough time. My hands were shaking so much I could barely move the heavy desk, but somehow I got it in place. The sound of footsteps outside the door made my skin crawl. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They moved slowly, deliberately, and that made it worse. I crouched against the door, trying to steady my breathing. I was still on the phone with the dispatcher, but I could barely hear her over the pounding in my head. "They're in the house," I whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Please hurry. Please." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought the dispatcher had hung up. But then I heard her voice again, quiet but firm. "Stay calm. The police are on their way." I didn't feel calm. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this panicked. Then the pounding started. It was soft at first, like testing the strength of the door, but it quickly grew louder. With every strike, my entire body tensed. My legs felt weak, and I was starting to shake uncontrollably. I pressed my back against the door, trying to make myself as small as possible. My brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but there was nothing I could do. The intruder was right on the other side. Then, silence. I didn't know how long it lasted. A few seconds? A minute? It felt like hours. The quiet was so thick I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I almost allowed myself to breathe when I heard it, a sharp, violent crash. It was the sound of glass shattering, the distinct, sharp noise of the bedroom window breaking. I whirled around, eyes scanning the room. The figure was climbing in through the window now. Slowly, methodically, with one hand gripping the frame and the other holding a gleaming hunting knife. I could see the edge glinting in the dim light. The man was tall, much taller than me, and the knife looked like it belonged in some kind of horror movie. My throat tightened. I froze, my eyes locked on the figure. He was almost in. Just a few more seconds, and he'd be on me. Suddenly I heard it. Sirens. The loud, wailing sound of police cars, distant at first, but growing closer. The intruder must have heard it too, because he froze. His body tensed as if debating whether to retreat or to finish what he'd started. My stomach turned at the thought of what would happen if he decided to fight. But before I could even process what was happening, the door crashed open. Officers flooded the room in an instant, guns drawn, shouting orders. The intruder spun around to flee, but they were on him in seconds. They tackled him to the floor, the sound of their boots thudding against the wood, the air thick with the rush of adrenaline. I couldn't take my eyes off the man. His mask was ripped off, revealing a gaunt, sunken-eyed face that looked like it belonged to someone who hadn't slept in days, or maybe someone who hadn't eaten in weeks. His eyes locked with mine, wide and frantic. I couldn't make sense of the look on his face. There was something almost predatory in it, like he was still trying to figure out how to get to me, even as they pulled him away. The officers dragged him out of the room, and I collapsed to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. I don't even remember the words they said. Everything was a blur of flashing lights, the sound of their voices, and the ringing in my ears. The officers told me later that he had been watching me for days. They found zip ties, duct tape, and a rag soaked in chloroform in his bag. My stomach turned as I realized how close I'd come to becoming another victim. If I hadn't locked that door, if I hadn't called 911 when I did, there's no telling what would have happened. It was the dead of night when I finally finished my shift at the diner. The clock on the wall blinked 12:17 a.m. as I grabbed my jacket from the back room and tossed it on. The clatter of silverware and the hum of the neon sign outside were the only sounds left in the place. It had been a long day, busy and draining, serving truckers and locals who passed through the sleepy little town in rural Texas. There was a strange kind of peace in the air now, though. The diner was closed, the buzz of conversation replaced with silence. I stepped outside, the heat hitting me like a wave. It didn't matter how late it was. Texas nights in the summer were always sweltering. The parking lot felt deserted. Most of the regulars had already left. The only cars left were a few trucks parked by the highway, their engines idling softly like they were waiting for something. I walked across the cracked asphalt, the sound of my boots echoing in the stillness. The air felt thick, like it was holding something back. My car, an old sedan that had seen better days, sat at the far end of the lot. I unlocked it, sliding into the driver's seat. I wasn't looking forward to the drive home. It was about a 45-minute stretch of lonely highway, the kind of road where if your car broke down, you were on your own. The sound of the engine coming to life made me feel a little better, like I was leaving behind the strange, empty diner and heading home. As I pulled out of the lot and onto the road, something didn't feel right. The headlights of my car sliced through the darkness ahead, but the highway seemed to stretch forever, empty and silent. I don't know what it was, but I had this creeping sensation crawling up my spine. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you want to turn around, but it was the kind that gnawed at you, like you were being watched. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of dry grass brushing against the road. The faint, distant hum of a truck engine could be heard somewhere far behind me, but it was quickly swallowed by the vast emptiness. And then, out of nowhere, I noticed it again. That weight, like something had shifted in the car, like something had settled into the back seat, unseen. My heart skipped a beat, but I couldn't bring myself to look. The car felt heavier, my chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat creeping down my back. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but I couldn't bring myself to check. The hairs on my neck stood up, and the eerie, unsettling sensation crawled up my spine like 1,000 tiny ants. That's when I heard it, a rough, sharp sound, like a breath too close to my ear. Before I could even react, a hand shot from behind me, clamping over my mouth. My body froze, but my mind was racing. I tried to scream, to fight, but the hand was firm, unyielding. Then a voice, low, menacing. It hissed in my ear, "Keep driving." My pulse surged, blood rushing to my ears. I could feel the cold edge of something hard pressing against my side. Metal, sharp, dangerous. A knife. It was a knife. My body screamed to take control, to fight back, but fear had me paralyzed. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. My foot hovered over the brake, but I kept my foot pressed against the gas pedal. The road stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving. There was nowhere to stop, nowhere to turn. "Keep driving," the voice repeated, sharper this time. I didn't dare look at the man who was holding me, his breath hot against my skin. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. My heart thudded against my ribs, and I could feel the car vibrating under the strain of my racing thoughts. Then, through my peripheral vision, I saw it. A faint light in the distance. A street light flickering above an old gas station. The faded neon sign barely visible in the darkness. It was the only sign of life, the only place that might have people, a way to escape. In that instant, I made up my mind. I wasn't just going to let him control me. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, slamming the car toward the shoulder. The tires screeched in protest, the car fishtailing as it skidded. The man behind me lost his grip for a moment, just long enough for me to make my move. With a sickening screech of metal against asphalt, I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, pushing the car forward. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. I whipped the car to the left, sending us crashing into something hard, something metal. The impact was brutal. Glass exploded around me and the airbags deployed with a deafening noise. Everything happened in a blur, lights flashing, the sound of crumpling metal, and a sharp pain in my side. I felt dizzy. Ears rang, and the world spun around me in a chaotic blur. The seconds stretched into eternity. My chest was tight, and my head throbbed with pain. Slowly, I forced my hands to unclench from the steering wheel. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fumbled to unbuckle my seatbelt. I couldn't think straight. Everything felt like it was happening to someone else. Then, I heard it. A groan. The man. He was alive. I turned my head just enough to see him stumbling out of the wrecked car, his body bleeding from the crash. The knife had fallen to the ground, but he didn't seem interested in it. He stumbled to his feet, eyes wild with panic, and without a single glance back at me, he bolted toward the woods, vanishing into the thick, dark trees like he was swallowed whole by the night. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. I was still reeling from the shock, trying to piece together the chaos of it all. That's when I heard the truck. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and within seconds a large semi-truck pulled over to the side of the road. The driver, a rough-looking man in a flannel shirt and worn jeans, jumped out and ran toward me. "You all right?" he shouted, kneeling beside my car. I could barely speak. My breath was ragged, my hands trembling as I tried to explain. "The guy, he attacked me. I don't know where he went." The trucker didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, explaining what had happened. I could barely process what he was saying. My mind was still reeling from the fear, from the adrenaline, from the thought that I had almost been killed. It felt like hours before the sirens finally arrived. The officers combed the area, searching the woods near the crash site. I could see them moving through the trees, flashlights scanning the dark ground. They came back to me empty-handed. "We couldn't find anyone," one of them said, his voice cold. I blinked in confusion. But I saw him. He went into the woods. I don't know if I'll ever have an answer. All I know is that I was lucky to survive. But when I think back to that night, to that feeling of something or someone lurking in the back seat, I don't know how I made it out. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.